Good morning. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on policing strategies for the 21st century, and I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Policing is an inherently dangerous job. Our law enforcement officers deserve our gratitude for the work they do on a daily basis to make sure that our streets are safe, the most helpless in our communities are protected, and those who commit crimes are brought to justice. I am very concerned that force is used appropriately and that police officers are taking appropriate steps to protect innocent civilians when they make encounters. There is increasing unrest in our urban communities about policing. Protests in Ferguson, New York, and Baltimore were the outgrowth of the use of force by police officers stopping a suspect. Although no charges were filed against the officers in question in 2 of those cases, it is clear that there is widespread disagreement about the actions of police in those instances. What started as peaceful protests turned into violent riots, where again, the police reaction to those riots was brought into question. At the same time, I am increasingly concerned with the repeated targeting of our police and law enforcement personnel. Last week we learned that 2 more police officers were killed. Officers Dean and Tate, responding to a routine traffic stop in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, were gunned down by a group of 5 men. This comes on the heels of the more widely known murders of officers Ramos and Liu in New York. It's been reported that they were specifically targeted by a man looking to kill a police officer. While I refuse to consider the actions of police officers in Ferguson and New York as justifying the responses that befell those cities, it is clear that we must find a better way for our police and citizens to interact both in everyday situations and when more difficult circumstances arise. We have a distinguished panel before us today with deep knowledge of police training, tactics, and policies. We have long-standing leaders in the police community. We have instructors responsible for police training. And finally, we have those tasked with monitoring those police departments that have not met the standards we require of them. I am hopeful that this will be a constructive and positive hearing that focuses on current rules and regulations in place, the training our officers receive, and how we can train them better in order to apprehend criminals while minimizing harm to innocent citizens. I am especially interested to hear what we can do to raise the level of trust among our police officers and citizens while still protecting both. Policing will never be an easy or safe job, but I believe we must do everything we can to ensure that our officers have the tools and training they need to protect themselves and our nation's citizens. I'd also like to thank the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, the ranking member, for working with us so closely to arrange this hearing. And I was also inspired by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, who has been speaking with me for some time about this issue, and I thank them both. And I want to assure all of you that the purpose of this hearing and the ongoing efforts of this committee following this hearing is to make sure that we are doing everything possible to address the problems that have arisen in recent months, to make sure that our communities are safer, our police officers are safer, our citizens' rights are protected, and that we will not rest until we make progress in those regards. And at this time, it's my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Goodlatte, our chairman. Members of the committee, and to our distinguished witnesses, and to those who have come to this hearing, law enforcement accountability is an issue that is very topical given current events, but also one that has long been a concern of mine and many other members. As a member of Congress, I have stood on the streets of Detroit with a bullhorn and appealed for calm while my city burned around me in 1967. Thinking back, there was a race riot in Detroit in 1943. On too many occasions, I've met with the grieving relatives of those who have lost their lives at the hands of police, but I've also met with the families of police officers who lost their lives in the line of duty. Some of these officers were killed by violent criminals, while other officers were inadvertently killed by their colleagues, or some of their colleagues, who could only see the color of their skin. I have co-chaired town hall meetings with fellow members of Congress and others across this nation in response to policing incidents in Chicago, Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. At these meetings, we tried to help the residents of these cities make sense of how to respond to their collective sense of loss and to understand the role of the federal government in protecting their civil rights. I have proposed numerous bills to both help protect the safety of police officers and to provide a system of accountability for law enforcement. For example, I worked with Attorney General John Ashcroft at the invitation of President George Bush to craft federal legislation intended to end use of racial profiling in police practices, which is currently pending in this committee is House Resolution 1933. And next month, I plan to introduce comprehensive legislation dealing with accreditation, data collection, and policing practices. Fortunately, our committee has generally approached the issue of policing with a strong bipartisan spirit. We have enjoyed success in passing reform legislation, notably the passage of the Pattern and Practice Enforcement Statute, which was codified as Section 14141 of Title 42 of the United States Code in 1994. And we twice passed the Traffic Stops Statistics Study Act under the chairmanship of Chairman Henry Hyde. By scheduling today's hearing, Chairman Goodlatte continues this legacy and is commended for his willingness to face a difficult issue that has divided communities around the United States. Any discussion of law enforcement accountability must be premised on the recognition of the dangerous and difficult job that all police officers perform. The vast majority of police officers perform their jobs professionally and without bias. But like any profession, there are those who make it difficult for the rest to serve their communities. And at the outset, I must agree with Professor Orlando Patterson when he says that the complex and confounding questions raised by Ferguson, Baltimore, and other cities go well beyond the issues of racism and violent police behavior. What occurred in those cities clearly resulted from a vicious tangle of concentrated poverty and culturally disenfranchised youth, as well as a countervailing culture of law enforcement disconnected from their communities that is lacking appropriate standards and oversight. Yesterday, President Obama was in Camden, New Jersey to highlight his administration's initiatives to address the challenges of policing in our inner cities. While I support the President's efforts and look forward to working with him to implement his programs, there's no substitute for concrete performance standards for state and local law enforcement agencies that receive billions of dollars each year in federal funding. For reform-focused police executives, many of the current administrative programs are merely icing on the cake and probably will not reach many chronically underperforming or troubled departments. The entire purpose of Section 14141 was to add teeth to federal enforcement that was absent in the grant-making process. Although pattern and practice enforcement has been effective in cases of individual departments, it is far too resource-heavy to reach across the more than 17,000 police departments in our country. There must be another way, and I hope that today we can talk about the combination of federal, state, and local measures that are essential to support necessary changes in policing culture. The national outcry that arose after Michael Brown's death is nothing new to those who are students of policing practices. From the Sean Bell, Abner Louima, and Amadou Diallo incidents in New York, to the Eddie Macklin shooting in Miami, to the Timothy Thomas over-the-Rhine shooting in Cincinnati, and the Donovan Jackson beating in Inglewood, the response is nearly always the same. National outcry, followed by well-intentioned programs that never quite get to the heart of the matter. Out of respect for all of who have lost their lives over the last 9 months, both law enforcement and civilian, I hope that we can dedicate ourselves to engaging the difficult issues to make lasting change in our communities. I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conyers, and without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. We welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses today, and if you would all please rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Please raise your right hand. Do you and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony that you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that the witnesses responded in the affirmative. Sheriff David A. Clarke, Jr. has served as the sheriff of Milwaukee County, Wisconsin since March 2002, when he was appointed by then-Governor Scott McCallum. He was elected in November 2002 and is currently serving his 4th term as sheriff. Sheriff Clarke holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice management from Concordia University, Wisconsin, a master's in security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School, and has completed various executive education programs with the FBI and at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Matthew Barge is the Vice President and Deputy Director of the Police Assessment Resource Center, PARC. Among Mr. Barge's areas of expertise are use of force policies, officer training, and counseling law enforcement agencies to achieve efficient constitutional policing. Mr. Barge graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University and holds a JD from the New York University School of Law. Susan Rahr is Executive Director of the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, a position she has held since 2012. From 2005 to 2012, she served as the first female sheriff in King County, Washington. She previously spent over 30 years as a law enforcement officer. She received a bachelor's degree from Washington State University and currently serves as a member of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. W. Craig Hartley, Jr. is the Executive Director of the Commission on Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, CALEA. He began his career with the Greensboro, North Carolina Police Department in 1989 and served in a number of positions within the agency before becoming Assistant Chief of Police. Prior to joining CALEA, Mr. Hartley worked for the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, where he led the department's Public Policy Planning and Research Division. Mr. Hartley holds a bachelor's in criminal justice from Appalachian State University and a master's in public affairs from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Professor Deborah Ramirez teaches criminal justice at the Northeastern University School of Law in Boston, Massachusetts. Much of her work focuses on strengthening partnerships between law enforcement and communities, which is integral to building trust and fair, effective policing. Professor Ramirez received a bachelor's degree at Northwestern University and a JD from Harvard Law School. All of your written testimonies will be entered into the record in their entirety. I ask that each of you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. And I shouldn't say this to law enforcement personnel, but it works like a traffic light. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired, but when it turns yellow first, that means speed up. Sheriff Clarke, you may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and honorable members on the Committee of the Judiciary. Thank you for the opportunity to state my view, which is backed by 37 years of experience from ground level concerning police accountability, aggression toward police, public safety concerns, and what might be the right thing for us to work on now. Since the events that led to riots in Ferguson, Missouri, police use of force has become scrutinized nationally. Police use of force should be scrutinized, locally that is. It should be examined in terms of factual data and circumstances that led to the police action and not from the emotional foundation of false narratives or catchy slogans like hands up, don't shoot, no justice, no peace, or Black Lives Matter. Let's leave that conduct for the public to engage in, not the mainstream media or those elected officials who can't resist the opportunity to exploit the emotions of an uninformed or misinformed public simply for political gain. We will no doubt hear a lot of statistics thrown about today, some distorted to achieve a predetermined agenda. Others are legitimate. In 2013, the United States Department of Justice, under Attorney General Eric Holder, did a study in conjunction with the National Institute of Justice on traffic stop data. They found that when you use control factors that statistics and research require for legitimate findings, any racial disparities are attributed to differences in offending. The study showed that black drivers violated speeding and other traffic laws at much greater rates than whites. That conclusion of the study under Eric Holder-led DOJ might be ugly to some, but is what the data and research have found. That same study showed that 3 out of every 4 black drivers said the police had a legitimate reason for stopping them. The same is true in arrest and incarceration data for African American males. Participation rates in violent crime explain the disparity of why so many black males are locked up in prison. Black males are disproportionately involved in violent crime, and this violence is predominantly perpetrated against other black people. It is not the result of a discriminatory criminal justice system. Blacks make up 37.5% of the prison population at the state and federal level. If we release those convicted on drug charges alone, the percentage of black males in prison would drop to 37%, a mere 0.5%. So much for the myth of black males filling our prisons merely for drug convictions. Not to mention that illegal drug use is the scourge of the black community and leads to a great deal of the violence that occurs. The police use of force data also tells a different story than the false narrative propagated by cop bashers in the liberal mainstream media. A recent study that looked into police use of force between 2009 and 2012 showed this breakdown. 61%, or 915 of the 1,491 people who died from police use of force were white males, while 32%, 481, were black males. It is a myth that police kill black males in greater numbers than anyone else. Black-on-black crime is the elephant in the room that few want to talk about. We could talk about the police use of force, but it doesn't start with transforming the police profession. It starts by asking why we need so much assertive policing in the American ghetto. Are police officers perfect? Not by any stretch of the imagination. Are police agencies perfect? Not even close. But we are the best that our communities have to offer. Instead, the conversation should be about transforming black underclass subculture behavior. The discussion must start with addressing the behavior of people who have no respect for authority, who fight with and try to disarm the police, who flee the police, and who engage in other flawed lifestyle choices. Bashing the police is the low-hanging fruit. It's easier to talk about the rare killing, fortunately rare, of a black male by police because emotion can be exploited for political advantage. The police are easier to throw overboard because they can't fight back politically. This, however, is counterproductive and will lead to police pulling back in high crime areas where good, law-abiding black people live. Black people will be the losers in all of this as violent crime rates skyrocket over time. This means more black victims. Economist and author Thomas Sowell, a man I admire, said this about policing. If people who are told that they are under arrest and refuse to come with the police cannot be forcibly taken into custody, then we do not have the rule of law when the law itself is downgraded to suggestions that no one has the power to enforce. Sowell further pointed out that for people who have never tried to take into custody somebody resisting arrest, to sit back in the safety and comfort of their homes or offices and second-guess people who face the dangers inherent in that process, dangers for both the officer and the person under arrest, is yet another example of the irresponsible self-indulgences of our time, unquote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheriff Clarke. Mr. Hartley, welcome. You need to push that button.
Chairman Goodlott and Ranking Member Conyers.
Pull a little closer to you as well.
Is this better?
Yep, that's better.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Chairman Goodlott and Ranking Member Conyers and members of the committee, on behalf of the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, commonly referred to as CALEA, thank you for this invitation today to present ideas on policing strategies for the 21st century. As a part of this discussion, I think it is important to recognize that every year, the over 1 million police officers dispersed across 18,000 agencies make over 40 million public contacts where they encounter incredibly sensitive and highly emotional situations. These interactions result in millions of arrests annually, and police use force or the threat of force 1.4% of the time, using mostly low-level applications. Statistically, this is a strong indication of the adherence to the democratic principles of public safety service in this country. However, this can only occur where there are trusting relationships between the community and the police. Recently, the country has observed situations where this confidence has eroded, resulting in undesirable outcomes. Although there is no single solution, CALEA accreditation provides a strategy that institutionalizes best practices through the application of policing standards. The model promotes community confidence and instills accountabilities across all levels of participating agencies. About 5% of law enforcement agencies participate, which equates to a little more than 25% of the nation's law enforcement officers working for enrolled agencies. Given this level of penetration, the standards serve as a powerful tool to influence police policy and practice. The standards remain relevant through a dynamic process of review by leaders in public safety industry, which include practitioners, academicians, judicial officials, and other subject matter experts. Additionally, research from leading professional associations is leveraged, and the process considers information from special interest groups on such topics as victims' rights and procedural justice. CALEA recently launched a review of standards to consider findings from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and recent DOJ investigations of police agencies. All this with a focus on creating service philosophies that balance the need for safety and security with constitutionally protected rights and freedoms. The process of accreditation also focuses on intended outcomes. This is accomplished through a sophisticated system of linking agency policy to standards and ensuring practices complement organizational directives. It is reinforced through data collection, on-site observation, agency reporting, community input, and public commission hearings. As examples of these standards, participating organizations must develop effective citizen complaint procedures. This must include investigations of all complaints, including those of an anonymous nature. The procedures must establish timelines for notification to complainants and result in the posting of summary data for public consumption. From an operational perspective, integrity in criminal investigation procedures is included in the accreditation process. This involves accountability with the preservation, collection, maintenance, and presentation of evidence. Policies related to interviews, lineups, and show-ups must be developed and followed. CLIA accreditation requires agencies to develop community involvement practices to include establishing liaisons with community organizations, the involvement of community members in the development of policy, and publicizing agency objectives. Although these are only a few outputs of accreditation, it demonstrates how standards address core issues impacting community confidence while supporting police as an institution. As an association, CLIA supports reasonable legislation to improve professionalism in the field of public safety. We support the concept of voluntary participation in accreditation to promote productive relationships with agencies. We support incentives that support agencies pursuing accreditation, and we advocate for stronger interaction with other governmental and non-governmental entities for standards development. And we value approaches that gradually and systematically transition public safety agencies to programming with reasonable implementation timelines and technical assistance. The more than 1,030 public safety agencies enrolled in CLIA accreditation have voluntarily committed to demonstrating professional excellence through standards, compliance, and assessment. I would encourage lawmakers to support accreditation as an important tool for addressing the professional delivery of police services as a part of 21st century policing strategies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Ms. Rahr, welcome.
Oops. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it's my honor to be invited to testify today. I'd like you to know a little bit about my background so you can put my comments in context. I started policing in 1979 as a patrol deputy, and for the next 33 years had the privilege of serving my community in assignments such as patrol, undercover narcotics. I commanded our gang unit in the Seattle metropolitan area for 3 years and spent a great deal of time working with police conduct cases and training. When I retired as the elected sheriff in 2012, I had the good fortune of coming to our state's police academy where we train all 10,000 law enforcement officers in the state of Washington. I've learned a great deal from those recruits. As we embark on this dialogue today, I think it's critically important that we consider a wide range of factors that impact the environment in which police operate, and that we consider strategies that are most likely to increase public trust and improve public safety. I'd like to highlight two of these major factors. To add to the context, I think we have a tendency to talk about the bad apples. I'd like to talk about the barrel and the people who make the barrels. The first factor is the absence of a national coherence in policing. We have 18,000 individual police departments, each with unique cultures and reflecting the policies and practices that are a product of those 18,000 local governments, with a diverse range of values and expectations. Agency size ranges from 1 officer to more than 34,000 officers. About half of those 18,000 agencies have 10 officers or less. All of these departments operate in one of our 50 states, each with a unique system of justice that dictates how criminal cases are initiated, processed, and adjudicated. Although many states mandate peace officer certification and standards for hiring and training, most states exert limited control over their local law enforcement. Outside of consent decrees and the distribution or withholding of federal funds, the influence of the federal government on local policing is also limited. The bottom line is there is no single description of United States police culture and practice. The environment and the challenges faced by police departments vary widely, and the control and oversight of our police is almost exclusively local. The second major factor to consider is that police departments do not operate independently. In most cities, police chiefs are hired or fired by the mayor or another elected municipal executive. Most sheriffs are elected by the voters that they are sworn to protect and serve. When police exert control over citizens, they do so at the behest of an official elected by the people. Crime control strategies don't emerge in isolation, nor do decisions about police accountability. Those decisions are made by independently elected officials and prosecutors. Too often, the scrutiny of disturbing incidents begins and ends with the police department, with little examination of those factors outside the agency that influence priorities and practices. The importance of a broader focus of inquiry was illustrated in the recent examination into the government practices in the city of Ferguson. The findings serve as a powerful example of the influence of governing forces outside of the police department itself. Ideas for improving policing in the 21st century need to consider both of these major factors. Most changes in policies and procedures must be adopted by local governments in order to be implemented. For example, the requirement to use body-worn cameras must consider local and state laws related to the gathering, management, and disclosure of data, as well as local and state laws protecting individual privacy. These changes will take time, require a great deal of cooperation, and in some cases the barriers may be insurmountable. There are, however, meaningful steps that can be taken at various levels of government without changing laws. These steps will improve the culture of policing and expand police training in ways that contribute to increased public trust and improved safety. The recommendations of the President's task force contain a full range of actions that can be implemented immediately and some that are more long-term strategies. One of the areas of focus contained in the recommendations relates to police training. I sent to you a copy of an academic report that I co-authored. It was published by the Kennedy School at Harvard and published by the National Institute of Justice. This paper expounds on the importance of addressing the leadership culture in police departments and suggests a path toward improving culture through effective training. I hope these ideas will be beneficial as this committee explores ways to improve policing in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rahr. And Mr. Barge, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Conyers, distinguished members of the committee, my name is Matthew Barge. I'm the Vice President and the Deputy Director of the Police Assessment Resource Center. For 14 years, PARC has provided independent counsel to upward of 30 police agencies and communities, helping them solve problems and incorporate best practices on effective, safe, and constitutional policing. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. In light of recent events, some have wondered whether local police agencies are capable of transforming or repairing trust with the communities that they serve. I'm here to tell you that police departments can change, and indeed are changing. Real reform is difficult and messy work, but agencies can put in place the systems, the policies, and the culture necessary to self-manage the risk of unconstitutional policing and enhance community confidence. Some agencies affirmatively seek reform. The voluntary implementation of PARC's recommendations in Portland, Oregon, for example, led to significant decreases in use of force and complaints about police, without increases in crime or officer injury. However, local law enforcement is not always good at self-identifying problems. I work daily with police officers who represent public service at its most selfless and laudable. But the departments where they work often resemble what might happen if a stereotypical Department of Motor Vehicles ran the U.S. military, an inefficient, inept bureaucracy overseeing a rigid command and control structure. This produces a culture often resistant to new approaches, transparency, and real accountability. Where issues fester, the U.S. Department of Justice may exercise the authority granted by this body to conduct an investigation into alleged patterns of misconduct. Where allegations are substantiated, a federal court overseeing consent decree may result. The process is akin to emergency open heart surgery for police departments. It addresses serious systemic issues and is used selectively and at critical moments. Currently, DOJ is enforcing 10 consent decrees. PARC's executive director is the court-appointed independent monitor for one, addressing the Seattle Police Department, where I serve as his deputy. Regardless of how reform is initiated, the bedrock of policing in the 21st century must be a strong, responsive relationship between the nation's police departments and the communities that they serve. To that end, a common playbook of specific real-world reforms is emerging for promoting public and officer safety, efficiency, constitutional rights, and public trust. First, officers need more specific guidelines on using force in the real world. The bare, often vague requirements of courts in this area may work for judges in the comforts of their courtrooms, but officers and communities need clearer and more pragmatic rules. Second, departments need internal mechanisms for critical self-analysis. For instance, a standard DOJ consent decree reform is the creation of a dedicated board for critically evaluating all uses of force, so that a department can continually update policy, procedure, and training in light of real-world lessons learned. Likewise, permanent civilian oversight mechanisms can give communities a real-time check and an important say in how policing is conducted. Third, too many agencies have no idea what their officers are doing. If data exists on use of force or stop activity, it's often inaccurate, inaccessible, or ignored. Policing in the 21st century needs to take full advantage of the information systems that we take for granted in so many other areas of public and private life. Fourth, in the cities where we work, we continually hear from individuals that the weights and burdens of law enforcement are not equally shared, and there is some empirical evidence to support that proposition. The challenge for police departments is to find ways of addressing an issue that, at minimum, is deeply affecting the police-community relationship. Forward-thinking departments are providing officers with training on minimizing the effects of implicit bias and on person-based decision-making. Modern American policing faces an era of unparalleled challenges, with too many communities viewing the police as them rather than us. The challenge that law enforcement agencies must embrace is to implement the kinds of common sense steps that might enhance accountability and enhance public trust. With that, I thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Barge. Ms. Ramirez, welcome. You'll want to turn that on.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers and the House Committee on the Judiciary. The police killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner in July and August of 2014 have triggered protests not only in the cities in which those killings occurred, but also throughout this country. And since those shootings, there have been others. Freddie Gray in Baltimore and Walter Lamar Scott in South Carolina. It's plain to me, and I expect to all of you today here, that these protests are not just about the unwillingness to prosecute all but one of those officers for these shootings, but about a long, simmering resentment in the African American and Latino communities that the criminal law applies differently to them than it does to white Americans, that the police too often stop and frisk Latino and African American youths with impunity and without reasonable articulable suspicion, that automobiles driven by African Americans, especially in white neighborhoods, are too often stopped by police for driving while black, that the death of a black man at the hands of police is seen as more forgivable than the death of a white man, that prosecutors are less willing to see Hispanic and African American defendants as candidates for rehabilitation who deserve and need a break, and therefore they are more willing to press for mandatory sentences against them, and that more black men age 18 to 21 are in prison or in jail than in college. We can and should debate how accurate the statistical studies are and how accurate these perceptions are, and whether they're more accurate in some states and municipalities than in others. But I think we can agree that these perceptions are accurate more often and in too many places than we would want them to be, and that the perception itself is a reason for great concern, because beyond the statistical studies, We cannot be one nation if a significant percentage of our community members believe they are receiving an inferior quality of justice or no justice at all. The protests have provided an impetus for change, but they can't produce change by themselves. We need to ensure that these protests are different from previous protests and that they don't merely cry out for justice, but actually lead to more justice. And to accomplish that, we need a roadmap for change. And we need to press our leaders in Congress and elsewhere to follow that roadmap and travel to a place where justice is more and fairer. To move past these tragedies, we need to do some concrete things. First, we need to strengthen police-community relations by creating community policing models focused on the development of partnerships between police organizations and the communities they serve. How? New infrastructure and architecture. Infrastructure and architecture that might provide the coherence we need and the coherence we need to bring to this enterprise. We need to create in every state federally funded community policing institutes dedicated to creating the tools, templates, training, and best practices for bringing the police and the community members to the table for discussions on how best to keep their communities safe and strong. And we need to increase police transparency by letting the public know what the police are doing. And that can only occur when state and local police departments are required to keep data regarding police stops, searches, and shootings, and to record the race of persons stopped, searched, or shot. Why? Because you can't possibly manage what you don't measure. Transparency also means requiring police to install cruiser cameras, to wear body cameras, and to monitor police discretion to turn those cameras off. My last point is about accountability, which means that allegations of police misconduct or situations in which a police officer shoots a civilian should be handled by an independent inspector general. The investigation and prosecutorial decision should not rest in the hands of a district attorney dependent on that police department for its criminal investigations, past and future. So we need police community partnerships, a state institute to support them, cameras, data collection, and an independent inspector general to investigate police misconduct. The roadmap doesn't end here today at this table. The next part is the most difficult. How do we implement it? The system is broken. We need Democrats and Republicans to come together to craft a roadmap to justice and figure out how to fund and implement it. Only then will we be able to create stronger and safer communities.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. I'll begin the questioning and start with you, Sheriff Clarke. When you talk with citizens, your toughest, do they want more or less of a police presence? Do they complain more about the actions of the police or about the inactions of the police?
They ask for more. They complain about both, and I think that's human nature. They want safer neighborhoods. They want safer communities. They know they're going to have assertive policing in some of these high-crime areas to get that done. It's situational. They complain about slow calls for service responses, things like that, which can have an effect on a person's trust in their law enforcement agency. In other words, we call, but they don't come. So it's a moving, it's fluid, and like I said, situational. And we deal with it on a situational basis.
Do your officers generally feel what the right word is, welcome, comfortable in these tougher communities to police?
Without a doubt. It's one of the hallmarks, I believe, of my administration, to create a relationship. You know, when we talk about trust, I believe, in the Milwaukee area anyway, that's what I can speak to personally, there's a great relationship. We do not have we meaning law enforcement officers, do not have a great relationship with the criminal element. There's no doubt about that. But I think sometimes I believe it exists, this lack of trust within segments of the community, but not as a whole within the minority community. I bristle at that perception.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Mr. Hartley, you wrote in your testimony that only 5% of the nation's law enforcement agencies participate in accreditation. That really surprised me. What's the biggest obstacle you face in terms of getting other agencies accredited? Is it leadership, cost, or something else?
I will tell you, I think it's a combination of all those things, but I think it really starts with leadership prerogative about what those organizational leaders think is important to them in the delivery of leadership across their organizations itself. We do hear concerns that the cost of accreditation is too much. We also hear that the in-kind cost associated with involvement in the process is difficult because our accreditation process requires them to do things that they otherwise may not do. I can tell you that the process is really structured around key and fundamental sound principles of police service delivery. And so the process of accreditation doesn't increase accountability that's already there. It measures accountability and serves as a yardstick and a framework to keep organizations focused on key and fundamental areas. But again, it does relate to cost in some cases and in-kind services and management of the process, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Ramirez, is there a problem with current legal precedents as they relate to the use of force? I don't know what's wrong with our microphone, but does it result in second guessing of officer decisions?
I'm sorry. Is the question whether or not...
I'll repeat it. Is there a problem with current legal precedents as they relate to the use of force? And does it result in second guessing of officers' decisions?
I don't think this is primarily a legal problem. I think it's a problem with the community not fully understanding all of the pressures, procedures, protocols that the police are engaged in, and the police not discussing and educating the community about the things that the police have to take into account as they go through a stop and search process. But I don't believe this is a legal problem. I think it's a training problem. I think it's a problem that involves that would be solved with better community policing.
Thank you. Mr. Barge, I'll let you answer that same question, but I also want to add, you mentioned in your testimony that after your organization was called into Portland, there was a sharp drop in officer-involved shootings, use of force, and citizen complaints without any increase in officer injuries. What do you think most directly causes that?
As the legal precedent question, I think that, as I said in my testimony, judges in courtrooms use a very different set of standards and rules to guide fair and efficient decision-making. Officers on the street, I think as all of us can attest to, you don't have the luxury of examining all of the facts as they turned out to be and have to make split-second judgment calls. And so I think one thing that police agencies can do right now is to ask themselves, how do I want our police officers to react in these emerging use of force situations, and craft more specific, clearer guidance where appropriate, and hold their officers rigorously accountable to those policies. The policies can do what the courts cannot as a condition of an officer being employed in that department. As to Portland, I think that what we did there was to institute a number of reforms that are very tested. They've been implemented in places where the DOJ has gone, in the consent decree process. And importantly, we had an opportunity to implement those reforms in a voluntary sort of capacity. The city wanted us there, and the police department wanted us there. And it was about sort of, instilling mechanisms whereby the police asked themselves difficult questions, asked what we could learn from incidents that went wrong, what could we do different in the future. And I think that kind of culture, just by the numbers that the city auditor found there, really it changed the department for the better.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you. I appreciate the different contributions from each of the 5 panelists, and I think we're off to a good discussion. I'd like you to know that thanks to the chairman and Mr. Scott and Sensenbrenner, we've been having hearings on overcriminalization. They started out for 6 months, and the chairman, Goodlatte, added 6 more months to it. It was so effective. This moves us further along. But the fact of the matter is, how do we change this culture? This goes back a long ways. This isn't something, a recent phenomenon at all. And so I'm thinking about how we get into this infrastructure and architecture that we're trying to move to, and I'd like to look at that for just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to raise the question of police prosecutions. We all know the conundrum. The prosecutor and the police work together much of the time, and then all of a sudden the prosecutor's got to decide whether to prosecute one that he's been working with a long time. Professor Ramirez and any of the rest of you, please, let's look at that for a moment.
As a former federal prosecutor, I've worked with law enforcement, and I know firsthand the difficult and dangerous work that they do. But I also believe that when there has been a civilian who's been shot or police misconduct, it is very hard for a prosecutor who works day in and day out with these law enforcement officers, and knowing that they've worked with them in the past and in the future, to make an independent decision, which is why I think we need a process different from the process that we have now. So I talk about having an independent inspector general make the decision,
yes,
but also we need more transparency in the decision-making process. So right now we have a secret grand jury process. Maybe we need something more like an inquest process, or some kind of new process in which, in these instances, we can develop a way to be more transparent about that pre-trial investigation that takes place now by a prosecutor in the grand jury context. And I wanted to say one more thing about reducing use of force. The studies have shown that in departments where they've used cameras, body cameras and cameras in the car, that there has been a significant decrease in use of force. And it gives us the opportunity to learn from the recorded instances about best practices for de-escalation. So when we have cameras and there is an incident, whether the officer succeeded or failed to de-escalate, we could learn more about it.
What's been your experience, sir, in terms of this problem of more or less where do we go from here? Mr. Hartley, what do you think?
Officers.
No, a little. We can go wider than that.
Yeah, I think just to kind of maybe parlay that discussion into something in a little more broad sense is, I think the most important thing for any organization to do is to prepare for that bad event. We know that regardless of the best planning, you're still going to have people that are engaged in fundamental decisions around the enforcement of law that have impacts on communities. But the reality of it is that if the preparation takes place in the proper way with the proper folks around the table, it relieves those expectations of negativity, if you will, and it promotes organizational confidence in how the process will be managed. I don't feel comfortable saying that one size fits all for each agency, because I think each jurisdiction brings on different attributes that have to be considered in the development of those types of things. But for the public's consideration and for the officer's consideration, confidence in the process is important, and it has to do with planning for the event from start to finish, and include community contacts, media engagement, and other processes related to the legal system.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rahr, just in closing, do you see some hope in President Obama's recent statements on the subject when he was in Camden yesterday?
I do. I think that there are a number of recommendations that will be helpful to every police department in the nation. For some departments, they'll be able to follow many of those recommendations. I hope that as time goes on, the distribution of federal funding and resources will take into account the cooperation of agencies that are doing their best to follow those recommendations.
Thank you, sir.
Chair, thanks. Gentleman, recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Ramirez, you mentioned a couple of cases in your opening statement, and I know that time is short when you only have 5 minutes, and you were not able to address other cases. I wanted to ask you whether or not you were familiar with a few other cases. Sandy Rogers and Scotty Richardson from Aiken, South Carolina. Are you familiar with that case?
No, sir.
How about Roger Dale Rice from Lawrence, South Carolina? Are you familiar with that case?
No, sir.
Eric Nicholson or Marcus Whitfield from Greenville, South Carolina? Are you familiar with that case?
No, sir.
Russ Sorrow from Greenville, South Carolina?
No, sir.
Or Kevin Carper from Spartanburg, South Carolina?
No, sir.
Professor, those are just a handful of the more than 340 police officers who were killed in the line of duty in South Carolina. And Kevin Carper's case is most instructive because his partner did CPR on the suspect that killed Kevin, trying to save his life. Let me ask it another way. Are you familiar with the case of Ricky Samuel?
No, sir.
How about Tamika Houston?
No, sir.
How about Nell Lindsay?
No, sir.
Miranda All?
No, sir.
Santiago Rios?
No, sir.
Those are all folks that were the victim of intra-racial homicides in South Carolina. And I hasten to add, there were not protests either with any of those police officer killings or any of the intra-racial killings. And I suspect you agree with me, Professor, that all lives matter. Whether you're killed by a police officer or your next-door neighbor, you're every bit as dead, aren't you?
Yes, sir. I actually, as a former prosecutor and someone who's worked with police officers, have the deepest respect for them.
So do I. And despite that deep respect, Professor, I still maintain the objectivity of prosecuting police officers who engaged in misconduct. We have a process in place if you don't think you can be fair. It's called recusal, which is what some of us did in every single one of our officer-involved shootings. We recused it to another prosecutor so he or she could make that decision. So there is a process in place. You called for a process. There is one. It's called recusal. Do you know, as a former prosecutor, or can you deign what may have been the biggest impediment to our being able to successfully prosecute homicide cases, particularly homicide cases involving victims of color, in my criminal justice jurisdiction? Do you know what the biggest impediment was?
In Massachusetts, one of the biggest impediments is trying to get witnesses to come forward.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. You have a victim of color, and we had trouble getting witnesses to cooperate with law enforcement and prosecutors, which then, as you know, diminishes the quality of that case and your ability to prosecute it, which may result in a lesser plea bargain because you don't have the facts, which may then result in what you said in your opening statement, which is people have a tendency to treat black lives differently than white, when the reality is the case wasn't quite as good. Isn't that a possibility too?
For every prosecutor who's out there, this is a serious problem, and you are correct in pointing that out, sir.
Right, and it wasn't just me pointing it out, Professor. I happen to have a fantastic chief of police when I was the DA. Fantastic man by the name of Tony Fisher, who happened to be an African-American chief of police. And he lamented the exact same thing you and I are talking about, is the loss of life in his community and the refusal of people to cooperate, even in a drive-by shooting of an 8-year-old at a birthday party. A drive-by shooting outdoors where the whole world saw the car drive by. And nobody would cooperate with the prosecution in the murder of an 8-year-old. So I hope that part of this 21st century police strategies conversation that we're having includes getting people to cooperate with law enforcement so you can hold people to the exact same standard regardless of the race of the victim. And I want to say this too. I want to thank my friend Ced Richmond and Hakeem Jeffries and others who are working on this issue because they want a justice system that is colorblind. After all, it's represented by a woman wearing a blindfold, so let's go ahead and make it colorblind. And both of those guys have worked really, really hard and will continue to do so, because let me tell you what my goal is. My goal is for witnesses to feel comfortable cooperating. But here's my other goal, and I'm out of time, but I'm going to share it with you. I want us to get to the point where we lament the death, the murder of a black female like Nell Lindsay, just as much if it's at the hand of an abusive husband, which it was, as we would if it had been at the hand of a white cop. I'd like to get to the point where we're equally outraged at the loss of life, and I hope we can get there. With that, I would yield back.
Chair, thanks. The gentleman recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and let me thank both you and the ranking member, my ranking member, for listening and engaging and leading. And I was delighted to participate in the process, and I'd like to say to my colleagues that this effort of criminal justice reform is going to be a committee effort. Every member's input and assessment and analysis and legislative initiatives will stand equal, I believe, in the eyes of the ranking member and the chairman, and certainly those of us who serve as the chairperson and ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, as I do. America will not be responded to unless this committee works together, and that our efforts are in unison and collective, responding, of course, to the many witnesses that will come before us. So this is the first hearing, and I think America should recognize the very large step that we are making. Sheriff Clarke, let me thank you for your service. We may agree to disagree, but there is no disagreement with your service and the sacrifice that you represent. As you indicated, we met a couple of weeks ago. Just May 15th, I was on the west side of the campus of this great Congress, dealing with the many families who had lost loved ones in law enforcement. So my tone today will be that we do ill when we take each other's pain lightly. The pain of Black Lives Matter, the pain of hands up, don't shoot, that pain of I can't breathe, that is pain. And it is equally the pain of Mr. Greer, who was on the steps of his house August 2013 and was shot in Virginia. He happened to be an Anglo or Caucasian male. What we have to do to make a legislative step of monumental change that gives our officers the confidence of their work, further enhance their training, is to be able to work together. My line of questioning will be, how do we fix these problems, and how do we get the 5% number, that is a lot of officers, to be 25%, 50% accreditation? That's what the American people, I think, are looking at. I don't want anyone's pain to be diminished, and I sit here today recognizing that pain. So let me just quickly say this regarding statistics. James Coney, the director of FBI, said the following about the Uniform Crime Report. The now 3-year-old source that was cited in the sheriff's testimony said the following: demographic data regarding officer-involved shootings is not consistently reported to us through our Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Because reporting is voluntary, our data is incomplete and therefore in the aggregate unreliable. Mr. Hartley, I have thought that data is important. Introduced a bill called the Cadet Bill to gather statistics on shootings by police and by individuals against police, because I believe in fairness. And so if this was required, would that be an asset to CALEA as you do your scientific work of providing insight for training?
Ms. Jackson-Lee, let me say that...
Is your mic on?
Sorry about that. Ms. Jackson-Lee, let me first start by saying that I think data helps drive decision-making, and it helps drive it in an important way, because you don't know what you don't know sometimes. And what we find is organizations that engage with CALEA and accreditation discover data during the process that really helps them make fundamental decisions that drive the organization in a responsible way towards community service.
Do you have enough money to accredit all of the police departments across America? Would you need some incentivizing, some funding to help you do that?
Well, we don't need the incentivizing or funding to help that occur, but those organizations sometimes do. Organizations that participate with us range in size from 10,000 to 10.
So funding to them would be a helpful component of police accountability.
I think that would support agencies in this mission.
Got a series of questions. On the CALEA standards on body cameras, police arrests and transport, and independent review of use of lethal force by law enforcement, are there standards? That's the question. On body cameras, police arrests and transport. One of the issues that I'm now concerned about, because when the issue came out in Baltimore, it wasn't sort of put aside. Police departments were saying all over, you know what? That's some of the things that we do. But do you have standards on that and the use of lethal force?
We do have standards on all those subjects. The one related to transport didn't particularly address the issue that was faced in Baltimore. However, there is a standard that encourages the safe transport of individuals regardless of the type.
So we need to help enhance that and make that a noticeable part of policing across America.
Well, I think that the standards themselves are a dynamic, living tool, and I think as we encounter new issues, and we certainly will, we have to be prepared to make those adjustments in our standards to address those issues.
Could I quickly ask you, Ms. Rahr, you have written about the obstacles of implementing changes in training programs, particularly opposition from those wedded to the status quo. Can you explain that, and can you also add to your conversation, I don't want any police officer to not go home to their family. That's a mantra that we all stand by, and everyone would say, we have great relationships. I'm a big believer in community-oriented policing. The father of community-oriented policing lives in Houston, Lee Brown. But could you comment on that, and then the idea of de-escalation in training and how that impacts on a police interaction?
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. The witness will be allowed to answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a very exciting hearing that generates a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have described the philosophical shift that I have been promoting for a couple of years as moving our culture closer to a guardian mentality rather than a warrior mentality. I believe the warrior mentality was a result of a political movement that started in the 60s when we declared war on crime, war on drugs, war on all sorts of things. The police agencies across this nation responded as they do to their political leadership in their communities. What I'm trying to do is help our new police officers find the right balance, because officers absolutely must have keen warrior skills, and they must be able to use them without hesitation or policy. But I want them to consider their role within our democracy, and that role needs to be the role of a protector, with the goal of protecting people rather than conquering them. When you try to initiate this type of a mindset shift, there is naturally going to be resistance. The greatest resistance I've encountered is just the misunderstanding of what I'm talking about. When I have the opportunity to explain it in more depth, most officers will say to me, that's how good cops have always done it. I want our recruits on their first day on the street to have the wisdom of a good cop with 20 years' experience.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the panel for your testimony today. Grateful for the time that you've taken to be with us today. Sheriff, I had an opportunity to speak with the law enforcement community in my community, and I did a roundtable discussion, had an open dialogue about the events of the day and some of the concerns that have been raised in this very discussion. They were concerned as well about some of the bad actors in their own rank and file that we've been seeing around this country, and very concerned about it, but also were adamant about the fact that they expressed that the vast majority of the officers that they work with, the emergency response personnel, are hardworking, good professional people who are there for a common purpose, and that is to serve the public. And they're concerned that that doesn't resonate, that we see more now about the bad acting than we do about some of this negative that's going on out there. And it's important that we identify and we deal with that, and we not tolerate it in any way, shape, or form. But it's also important that we do whatever we can to really rally behind those who have given so much in the law enforcement community. And I think I'd really like to know from you what's going on with the morale of the law enforcement community, and are you having problems with recruitment and retention of officers as a result of all that's going on around the country?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, we're at a tipping point, and it is something that I expressed not too long after what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, about the psyche of the American police officer who watches these things go on just like anybody else does, and the constant bashing and maligning of the profession is starting to take its toll. I just spent this week in the D.C. area for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Week, Police Week, if you will, and I talked to law enforcement officers from all across this country, and the one common theme I heard from them, first of all, their mindset is they're beleaguered right now. But the common theme that I heard is, Sheriff, I don't know if I want to continue to take that extra step anymore because I don't want to be the next Darren Wilson. I don't want to be the next, the officers in Baltimore or New York or anywhere because in a good faith effort, we're talking about the good faith action here of law enforcement officers. We operate in an environment of chaos and uncertainty when we get sent to these calls. And sometimes in this imperfect world, things can go horribly wrong, which they did in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm not going to get into, whose fault that was, but something went horribly wrong. But some of the best law enforcement work that goes on all across the country is called self-initiated. It's not the call for service. When an officer gets sent to a call for service, something already happened. It's reactive. The crime already occurred. But the self-initiated policing is when that officer, that man or woman, uses their experience, their sixth sense, if you will, their street sense, that criminal activity may be afoot. And they establish the reasonable suspicion so that they can make that stop consistent with our Constitution. They go and investigate. They pull that car over, or they go and what we call, stick up a group of individuals hanging on a corner or casing an area, so to speak, and we start to investigate. In self-initiated policing, you're going to find the guns that are being used to transport to and from drive-by shootings. You're going to find prohibited persons with firearms. You're going to find drugs. You're going to find people wanted on serious felony warrants through self-initiated policing. When that starts to fall off, and there'll be a lag time. This isn't going to happen overnight. The cops in this country are not going to quit. But over time, when they start to worry, they look and they see that suspicious vehicle or they see that suspicious individual and say, maybe not today. I don't want this thing to go haywire on me, and the next thing you know, I'm one of those officers that's, who becomes a household name in America. That is going to a lag time. Okay, I don't like to create hysteria, but over time I think it's going to have an effect on crime rates in those communities that need assertive policing the most, and that's our minority communities.
Thank you, Sheriff. I guess my time is up, Mr. Chairman, so I would yield back the balance.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I ask a question, let me just make an observation. Sheriff Clarke talked about the sixth sense, about taking that extra step. Sometimes taking that extra step is very necessary, but sometimes maybe we want the officer not to take that extra step. Maybe that's sometimes the problem, and that leads into the question of changing police culture, which Ms. Rahr talked about. Ms. Rahr, what is the greatest challenge in changing police culture?
I think the greatest challenge is recognizing that we have a real variety of cultures already existing across the country. When officers come to begin their career of service, most of them come to the table with the goal of doing something good, doing something to benefit the community, and then they're confronted with the realities of trying to do those good things. As a result, sometimes they take on a tougher persona, and they may lose sight of their original reasons for coming in the door. I think we need to work harder within the agencies, the leadership within the agencies, to support our police officers, make sure that they are healthy both mentally and physically, and that they feel supported by the agency. If an officer doesn't feel support inside their agency, they're not going to be willing to take a risk and try something different. They're not going to be willing to take as much of a risk to go out on a limb to protect someone. I think the internal culture of policing is absolutely critical. And when that is strong and healthy and confident, officers will be willing to try something different.
And what, if anything, can we in Congress do to help this change?
I would love to see Congress provide funding for improved training. I'll just cut right to the chase. There are a number of excellent programs already in existence that could literally transform the profession of policing in this country. I've been involved for the last couple of years with a program called Blue Courage, and that program seeks to support police officers, build their pride, build their sense of high morale, and especially assist them in seeing their appropriate role within as a guardian in democracy. That program costs money, and agencies that want to acquire that training have to pay for an officer on overtime to fill a district.
Appropriating money for training. Anything else?
Besides training?
Besides money.
Oh, besides money, I'm sorry. I think just the recognition that individual police agencies need to be supported. There is not going to be a one-size-fits-all federal solution to this.
Thank you very much. Professor Ramirez, we've had a number all over the country. We've had a number of problems, obviously, with violence against citizens who turned out not to have weapons or be guilty of anything. And sometimes the police officer gets prosecuted, sometimes the police officer doesn't, sometimes people are happy with that, sometimes they're not. We've seen these controversies. And, of course, it's been suggested that that the DAs are too close. They have to work day to day with the police officers. They're too close to make that decision without being thought partisan, whether they are or not. Should we consider a special should we have a law or regulation that mandates a special prosecutor or special master for investigations of police officers on the grounds that the DAs are, in fact, are too close to do this fairly? Would that be a good idea?
I think it would be a good idea.
And would that enhance community confidence and impartiality? And what are the negatives on it?
Yes, and while we do have a recusal system, that recusal system is now in the hands of the district attorney. So the district attorney in Ferguson did not recuse himself. And I think having laws and a process would create more legitimacy and more transparency to the public.
Thank you. And what is also, Professor, what is the greatest impediment to prosecuting police officers who violate constitutional rights of individuals in their official capacity. Obviously, we don't do, deprivation of civil rights under color of law very often. So what is the, by the federal government, what is the greatest impediment to prosecuting police officers who ought to be prosecuted? And there are some, obviously.
I'm someone who has prosecuted police officers, and I would say the first impediment is that in a prosecutorial office, when you work with police, when you work with law enforcement, it is very hard to decide to prosecute.
What we talked about in our previous question.
Right.
Okay, last, because my time is running out. Obviously, there have been a lot of controversial encounters, in some of which police officers were prosecuted, in others which they weren't. Sometimes the DA was excoriated for prosecuting, sometimes for not prosecuting. Would it be better for the sense of justice on the part of relatives of victims? Would it be better for the police officers who could be exonerated by this if police officers used body cameras all the time whenever they had such an encounter?
I think cameras are critical at this juncture, and we know that 4 things happen when you put cameras in place, because we've done research on this in both Great Britain and in this country where cameras have been used. First, the use of force diminishes, and that's important because police officers know that they're being recorded during an incident. Second, complaints against police officers diminish significantly, which reduces the cost and process of adjudicating these incidents after the fact and trying to find facts. Surprisingly, the third thing is that there's been an increase in successful prosecution of domestic violence because the police can record on the scene at the time what happened. The fourth thing that would be very helpful in moving the police culture from a warrior culture to a guardianship culture is that you could begin to have guardianship metrics. The current metrics are warrior metrics. How many people did you arrest, search, seize? How many guns did you seize? How many drugs did you seize? If you had cameras, you could begin to do 2 things. You could begin to evaluate officers on guardianship values. You could look at every 100th tape and say, was this officer respectful? Were they courteous? Did they follow procedures? Did they try to de-escalate? And finally, it serves as an early warning system to the police, because if you're watching on a regular basis, randomly, some of these cameras, you will discern who are the bad apples who have anger management issues and other issues.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Chairman, to paraphrase the poet, we sleep safe in our beds at night because rough men stand ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm. And certainly I believe that that in the people that wear the uniform, the many women that wear the uniform fit in that paradigm very well, because unless there are those that are willing to stand between the innocent and the malevolent, then the malevolent will prevail. And I think that those that wear the uniform and place themselves in those dangerous positions are among the most noble figures in our society. And Sheriff Clarke, I heard you on one of the television interviews and was so struck by your clarity and your eagle-eyed approach, and I thought this gentleman personifies that nobility that we talk about. And I really think that my children and the children of this country have a safer, more hopeful future because of people like you. So I just would suggest to you that others have come to the same conclusion. That might be why you're here in this hearing this morning. But my question is first for you. Have the recent events and the press response to those events had any kind of impact on your officers or made them more likely to employ strategies and tactics that might actually compromise their safety or the safety of the community?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, without a doubt, it's part of that tipping point that I talked about. You know, we need balance in this, obviously, and even if we find balance, maintaining it is going to be even more difficult. You know, an officer delaying that thing that's telling him or her to do a certain thing that doesn't happen, and it may cost them their lives. But let me say this about the use of body cameras. I am for the use of this technology. I think as a force multiplier, it can only help. But what I've been advising is I think we're rushing into this because we're going to end up with the law of unintended consequences. There are some privacy issues involved. It potentially could lead to fewer people wanting to come forward and cooperate with the police, especially in our minority communities where cooperating the police can lead you to a very bad conclusion. You don't want to be seen doing that. You don't want to be videotaped cooperating with the police. So we need to think about what impact it will have on witnesses wanting to come forward or even calling to report crime. And then I just want to close by saying that, you know, the use of body cameras and the early evidence that it's leading to fewer complaints and fewer instances of force is not, and there's evidence to suggest this, not to show it, that isn't just the result of the officer knowing that someone's watching. It's also letting the person who the officer's dealing with know, if I make a false complaint against this officer, it's going to be on video, and that could lead to a decrease in complaints as well. So I don't want to, you know, everybody to presume that it's because the officers are being watched that they're changing their behavior. And the same with suspects. They know they're being videotaped. Maybe they're less likely to fight the police and engage in some of that behavior as well. So that's why I say I support that, the use of those body cameras. But there's some things associated with it that have not been flushed out yet. And I just say let's not rush into this because it's not a panacea. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Ms. Rahr, in your testimony, you discussed the absence of a national coherence in policing, and I would wonder how would you propose to implement national policing standards while still ensuring that local police departments maintain the autonomy necessary to be relevant and effective in their own jurisdictions?
Sir, I haven't suggested national standards. What the task force worked on was recommendations to provide guidance and to provide more support for police departments. I don't think that we will ever come to a place where we have national standards for police policies and procedures. There's just too many different variables in each community.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just suggest, sir, that while I think everyone sees our police force in general as guardians, I'm thankful that there are enough warrior mentality among them to hold back those that would desecrate the innocent, and I would yield back with that.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing. It's most important. And I want to say on the front end, I started my legal career, I was a lawyer, as the attorney for the Memphis Police. Spent 3.5 years working for the police, and I understand policing and appreciate policing and know it's essential for an ordered liberty and a society that has on the front lines men and women willing to risk their lives. On the other hand, and I have great respect for Mr. Gowdy, and I'm happy he's back here, he mentioned that he looks for the day that we rue the death of the lady, and I forget her name, who was apparently killed by her husband in a domestic violence situation, the same as we rue the problems with when a white policeman kills a black citizen. And I would have to say, with great respect for Mr. Gowdy, there's a big difference. One is a private tragedy. The other is a public tragedy because it's under color of law. And while we'd like to see no crime whatsoever, and that would be wonderful, we can only mostly be concerned about color of law killings. And that's something we should be concerned about. It's a big difference. I would like to mention a question for Professor Ramirez. You mentioned that investigation and prosecutorial decisions rest in the hands of DAs. And Mr. Gowdy mentioned recusal. Well, recusal is up to the DA. And in the recommendations of the President's task force, there were recommendations that we have an independent prosecutor. Congressman Clay and I have introduced a bill that requires states to adopt independent prosecutors' laws or face a cut in burn JAG funding. This would present a solution. Is part of the reason that the problem exists, is it perception? Is that part of the reason why you think it's important to have an independent prosecutor? Because the perception the public has that there is not independent analysis of the cases and independent determination of who should be prosecuted.
Yes, sir. It is primarily a matter of perception because I believe that the prosecutors across the country try to do the best that they can and exercise the best judgment. But because of this inherent conflict, there may be the perception in the eye of the public that this was not a fair and full hearing.
Yeah, and the DA's main witnesses are always police. And in my community, the DA hires, which makes sense, former sheriff's people or police people to be their investigators.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so there's an inherent conflict, and that's the reason we have our bill, Lacey, Clay, and I, because we think that not only would it would eliminate the perception, but also there's certain cases where it's politics involved. And a base for the DA who's elected is law enforcement, and it's a political problem. So that's number one. Ms. Rahr, you were a member of the President's Task Force, and thank you for your work and your colleagues' work. The task force recommended the use of independent prosecutors as well, where police use force and it results in death or injury. Was that recommendation where DAs did not, if the recommendation was based on instances where DAs did not pursue cases against police as aggressively as they should have, or again, was this more based on the mere perception of a conflict of interest and the damage that that perception can have to public trust?
In our debates and conversations, the primary focus was on the perception. And it is in recognition that we have to maintain public trust. There are many prosecutors across this nation that are perfectly capable, I believe, of doing an objective investigation and prosecution of police shootings. Unfortunately, we have to maintain public trust. And when you try to balance those two issues, it was the consensus of the task force that public trust had to have more weight than just the pragmatism of having that particular prosecutor. And
we're down to my last minute, but you mentioned training. Part of the bill I have with Representative Clay requires some kind of sensitivity training for police to understand ethnic differences and gender differences, et cetera, and maybe sexual orientation differences. Do you think this would be helpful for police to have training in terms of the diverse societies that we have today?
I do believe it would be helpful to have training. I wouldn't title it sensitivity training because I think the police would shut down immediately.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But I do think...
my last minute, I appreciate it. Sheriff Clarke, let me ask you this. You mentioned in your testimony that much of the population in the state and low federal prisons was for violent crime, and probably that's true, but in the federal system it's mostly for drug crime. There's not so much violent crime there, and that's where the drug situation really fills up the federal prisons. And you said that illegal drug use is the scourge of the black community, and it is a problem, and leads to a great deal of violent crime. Would you agree that marijuana possession is not the scourge of the black community and does not lead to violent crime the same way that meth, crack, cocaine, and heroin do?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all.
Well, that's interesting, and I wished I had more time to talk to you. But thank you for allowing me this opportunity. And the defense attorney is not supposed to ask a question they don't know. But it was such an obvious answer, I just never thought I'd get that answer.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Resisting the temptation to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Cohen, I would...
Thank you, Mr. King.
I'd put out, I have in my hand an article of Investor Business Daily titled, and it's dated, by the way, the 6th of May, but it's titled, Obama Praised Baltimore Police He's Now Investigating. And it points out the study that the gentleman from Tennessee referenced, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which I have in my hand. And it also quotes from the police chief of Baltimore, who said he changed outdated procedures that put officers at odds with the community. This goes back to March of 2015 was the date of the report. Date of this article is the first week or so in May. It's interesting to me that I listened to the testimony of Ms. Rahr, and I give you credit for contributing to that report as well, that you'd like to see a shift from the warrior mentality to that of a guardian. And I think of the night I came here and I watched live on television the encounters with Baltimore police and rock-throwing mobs. And I saw the Baltimore police retreat from rock-throwing mobs. And so I'd ask you, is there a time they need to convert back to the warrior mentality, and was that the time?
I want to clarify when I talk about a guardian mentality, that absolutely does not imply retreat. It does not imply weakness. It implies being able to do two things at once.
Okay, but you could do that by just answering my question also.
I'm sorry?
You could also clarify by just answering my question, was Baltimore a time that they should have been more of a warrior mentality when they were facing rock-throwing mobs and retreating in the face of rock-throwing mobs? Was that a time that there needed to be an engagement of the police rather than a retreat?
They needed to use warrior tactics while having the mindset of a guardian.
Okay, thank you. And I would turn to Ms. Ramirez, and your testimony was very interesting to me. And I began thinking about our Constitution and where it says in the First Amendment, and I'll paraphrase but also accurately, Congress shall make no law respecting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, sir.
And there's no prohibition in that statement that I read, and would you agree that prohibits Congress from making a law or enforcing a law that would prohibit the people from violently assembling to petition the government for redress of grievances?
Congress does have the right to restrain violence in any form.
Yes, and so we agree that freedom of speech isn't the right to yell fire in a crowded theater.
Correct.
And then we could also agree, well, now I'll ask you, is it lawful or unlawful for one to pay protesters and encourage them to become violent?
I think that's a crime.
Yes, and I would agree with that also. And I would point out that and encourage violence, I want to pull that part out as a separate clause in my statement here for this purpose. I have in my hand a stack of tweets and stories and messages about protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, who now are protesting that they didn't get paid for the work that they did. And I put that word work in quotes. Have you reviewed any of that? Are you knowledgeable about any of that information, Ms. Ramirez?
No, but I would say this, that at this juncture, the most helpful thing that we could do is to try to bring the community and the police together in dialogues at the local level.
I do understand that. That was in your testimony, and I think the panel understands it. But if you were presented with information that showed that indicated that there was a funder or funders who had hired protesters that may well have been bussed into places like Ferguson, Missouri, or sent to places like Baltimore, and we ended up watching buildings and businesses be burned and property damage being created and, in some cases, assault, would that be worthy of an investigation, would you think, by the local police force?
Yes.
And what about by the U.S. Attorney General?
I think that that if there is evidence that someone were being paid to engage in violent protests and engage in violence, then that's a serious problem.
But you wouldn't think that if they didn't say violence, if they just said protest and it turned into violence, then that wouldn't be a crime?
That's a different situation.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn that and ask Sheriff Clarke if he could respond with his reflections upon this exchange that you've heard.
Sure. I was a little disappointed that there weren't more aggressive prosecutions and attempts to investigate some of the behavior of some of the rioters who were captured on videotape. One of the ones that stands out to me was a group of young individuals standing and dancing on top of a police cruiser that had been destroyed, so to speak, as if they had captured some sort of ground. It's government property. In Wisconsin, we have a statute inciting a riot. I think those things should be used both sides, and it just seems to be too much focus on what the police may have done, prior to the riots breaking out. As you indicated, there's a more socially acceptable way under our First Amendment to display your frustrations, your anger, and it's not rioting. It's not destroying property of other people. They abandoned. We saw that night what Baltimore would look like without the police, with police stepping back as they did, some say retreating. So it was an ugly situation for a great American city.
Thank you, Sheriff. I thank the Chairman and the witnesses, and yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for agreeing to hold this hearing. Sheriff Clarke, I heard about and read about your anti-Semitic testimony, astigmatic is the word I'm trying to use, your astigmatic testimony. Please note my strong respect and support for police and law enforcement, and also note my strong insistence that the rule of law apply to all, regardless of whether a person is a civilian or law enforcement. Now, the failure to prosecute police officers, militarized police responses to peaceful protests, and video footage of people dying by the hands of law enforcement have led us to where we are today. While discussing police accountability is an essential way to improve the relationship between the community and law enforcement, I hope that this committee will hold additional hearings that will allow us to specifically focus upon grand jury reform, use of body cameras, and the DOJ's data collection and transparency practices. Before we witnessed the militarization of police in Missouri, I had been working on Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, which prevents local police forces from receiving MRAPs, tanks, and other weapons left over from the war. And I'm very grateful and humbled that President Obama on yesterday issued an executive order that virtually ends the 1033 program. And I've also introduced the Grand Jury Reform Act, which calls for the use of special prosecutors and independent law enforcement agencies when there has been a police killing. And also I've introduced the Police Accountability Act, which would expand the DOJ's authority to bring charges against law enforcement officers. Sir, have you ever heard the name Ariston Waiters before? I'm sure that you haven't. He was just a 19-year-old unarmed black male, just a typical unarmed black male down in Union City, Georgia, who was shot while laying on his stomach, shot twice in the back by a law enforcement officer, a police officer from Union City. Shot twice in the back at close range. The officer who killed Mr. Waiters allegedly exhibited signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was an Afghanistan war veteran. According to the Anxiety Disorders Association of America, there are 40 million adults in the United States over the age of 18 who suffer from anxiety disorders. 7.7 million of those Americans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm concerned about the role mental health issues play in officers using excessive force against civilians. We've talked about police officers receiving training on how to apprehend people suffering from mental illnesses, but what is your department doing to make sure that officers themselves aren't suffering from mental illnesses?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, that is one of the most difficult situations that law enforcement officers today are dealing with, the mentally ill.
Well, I'm saying in terms of, would you agree that there must be some out there among the 7.7 million Americans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder who are law enforcement officers? You would not deny that, would you?
I don't have any data to refute it.
Well, but would you think that there may be some cases where there are officers who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and who are serving currently in law enforcement?
If I had to guess, yes. I had such a situation with one of my patrol sergeants who served in the first Gulf War, I believe, and he slapped around a handcuffed prisoner. I not only had him charged with the felony, he went to prison for 18 months.
Well, you're to be commended for that. And
it was a hard thing to do.
Does your department have a system of monitoring police officers or your officers periodically just to determine whether or not they have any mental health issues that could impede their ability to protect and serve the people?
No, not a systematic one. We have our standard early warning system.
Do you think it would be wise for the federal government? I noticed that in your statement you say that police use of force, I'm quoting you, police use of force should be scrutinized locally, that is. Does that mean that you don't think that the federal government should concern itself with these issues at all?
It's not that I don't think the federal government should concern itself. I think the federal government should observe what's going on across the nation with all of these issues, but I think it's a slippery slope.
You say that it should be scrutinized locally, though. Does that mean to the exclusion of the federal government?
Well, if I can finish the sentence.
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness is allowed to answer the question.
Thank you.
Sure, it should be scrutinized, without a doubt.
Well, thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Sheriff, if you could zero in on an issue for me concerning resources. If you had the money, would you hire more sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, and where would you put them? What would you do with them?
Yes, I would hire them. I'm in a court battle now with the county. I've had to sue the county to be able to hire some more law enforcement officers. I'd put them in the field based on what the data is showing where the crime's occurring, and not just the crime, but to provide a consistent, visible presence as a deterrent to crime, not just making arrests and writing citations, but to deter and prevent.
I agree with you. If you need any more help in that case with your superiors who fund money for your sheriff's office, let me know. I'd be glad to join in and help.
We'll do that.
Ms. Ramirez, I come from a long line of law enforcement people, and we take it very seriously. And I was an assistant district attorney. I was a district attorney. I was a United States attorney. My colleague here was one of the best assistant U.S. attorneys in the country. And I prosecuted cases myself. And I did not base my decision to prosecute cases involving African Americans or police on color or on the police. I based it on the rule of law. It had nothing to do with who committed the crime and who didn't and what police were involved. And you stated that you had a difficult time choosing over law enforcement and police. I never did. And if you have a difficult time like that, you shouldn't be a prosecutor. Why would you prosecute if you made that statement that I have a difficult time prosecuting police if they broke the law?
In my particular situation, as an assistant U.S. attorney, we had not prosecuted police officers in the past. And the U.S. attorney at the time said to me, do you plan to practice law as a defense attorney here in Boston afterwards? And
okay, let me reclaim my time now. You're going to get into the U.S. attorney or that individual. You know you have a step to go to if you have a complaint about prosecuting a case in the U.S. attorney's office. You can go from one person to another, and you can actually go to the Justice Department. Now, you also raised the issue concerning...
Which we did, sir, and may I say...
No, I'm asking the questions here.
Okay.
You also raised the issue of recusal, that it's up to the district attorney, it's up to the U.S. attorney. In my state, in the state courts and even in the federal courts, if there was a recusal, we looked at it very seriously, and I've recused myself from cases of my staff. But, you know, it's not totally up to you. You can take that step to the judge. You can petition the court for a recusal and petition as to why. You didn't mention that. And here's another thing that I ran into as a prosecutor, as my colleague said. It was very difficult to get young African-American males to testify against others, particularly even in cases where a family member was killed. Can you address that for a little bit, please?
That is one of the most important problems that needs to be addressed. And I want to talk about how we addressed it in Boston.
Would you please make it quickly? I only have a minute and a half.
Okay. We went to the community organizations, we went to the faith-based community, and we talked to the community and we asked them why people were unwilling to come forward as witnesses. There were a myriad of causes. We set up a process and hearings. As a result, we had, I don't know how many cold cases that were solved through a process in which the faith-based community went out, did outreach to the community organizations did that, and we have improved.
Reclaiming my time, that I agree with you, and that's a good way to handle it, but you do agree it's a problem.
It's definitely a problem, sir.
It's a big problem. Have you, you've had an extensive, exemplary career, but have you ever ridden with a police officer in the car when they're faced with a quick reaction situation? I know you couldn't do it as an assistant U.S. attorney, but as a DA, have you been on the street when a police officer had to make a split-second decision that has taken the United States Supreme Court 2 years to determine what is right and wrong on a 5-4 decision?
Yes, I have been in cars where police had to make split-second decisions, and I will tell you, I found it very frightening.
Sure, yeah. But
and they do a job.
There's a difference between a split-second decision and the fact that someone has to determine over a period of time what is right and wrong. And you did cherry-pick a lot of cases, but you know, you didn't bring up the issue that the number keeps coming out there that 93% of the young black males, those ones that are murdered, 93% are killed by young black males. Why is this happening, and what can we do to change that?
That is a serious problem, sir, but I do agree with others who have said what happens under color of law is different from what happens privately between two private individuals. They are both problems, but they are different problems. And when someone kills under color of law, that merits a different process.
I think any prosecutor worth his or her salt understands that very, very much. And I yield back the time that I...
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Rahr, you have used a new approach of policing called LEAD, Listen and Explain with Equity and Dignity, which puts a premium on conversation and listening during a police encounter. Could you walk us through a hypothetical situation where LEAD has worked to de-escalate a situation and tell us why it works?
The purpose of developing the LEAD model was to simplify the principles behind procedural justice and give officers very specific, tangible behavioral direction. In situations where there's conflict, taking the time if there is not a threat present. I want to be very clear about that. If somebody's pointing a gun at you, you don't listen and explain. You do what you have to do. But in most police interactions in the community, there is time. And if officers are reminded of the benefit of listening, that will help set that interaction going down the correct track. Most police officers, like myself, we like to step in and control things, and we have to be reminded to stop and listen. When people say police should treat people with respect, the most effective way to convey respect is to listen. So we really want to emphasize that for our officers. The other area where many officers forget is that we know the system inside out. We know how the process is going to work. We know what's going to happen next. People that we're interacting with don't know that. And it's that lack of knowledge that creates another level of conflict. And again, if the officer is reminded, tell the person what they can expect, they will be more likely to cooperate. When we talk about equity, that is simply to underscore, make sure that you are recognizing whatever biases you bring to the table, make sure that you're making your decision on the outcome in an equitable way, and always leave with the person you're interacting with their dignity intact, and act with dignity yourself. A lot of officers will mock whenever we use an acronym, and I get that, but it's also a very effective way to teach very specific behavior.
In fact, talking about dignity, studies have shown that people in a community care more about how they are treated by police rather than the actual outcome of a police encounter. Police that may pull people over for a driving offense may find that people care more about whether they were treated fairly by a police officer than whether they actually got the ticket. But as you've acknowledged in the past, empathy and patience do not necessarily come naturally for some police recruits. And something as simple as officers having friendly, non-enforcement related conversations with community members have shown to have huge benefits in building community trust. How do we change things so that the system values these characteristics in our police?
I think we start in the training academy by modeling that type of behavior and being very clear about that as an expectation. We also need to clarify that empathy is not the same as sympathy. Empathy means you understand what the person in the other side of the interaction is experiencing. I think it starts with training. I think it was mentioned by another witness that we have to come up with appropriate measures. People will rise to those things that are measured, and when we find ways to measure officers behaving in ways that convey respect and dignity, that behavior will increase.
Mr. Barge, thank you for acknowledging the role that implicit bias might play in making the type of quick decisions police encounter every day. Social science research has shown that even individuals who believe that everybody should be treated equally may be affected by implicit biases or subconscious associations between people of color and a perception of aggression and crime. Can you give us an example of a situation in which an officer's perception about an individual might influence the way they react to that individual, and how could police departments work to preemptively dismantle this implicit bias?
Well, I mean, I think one of the prototypical examples is one that Sheriff Clarke mentioned earlier, sort of the self-initiated stop, maybe a broken taillight and that kind of thing. And not maybe even necessarily the initiation of the stop, but sort of how that interaction proceeds in that critical first few seconds. That it may be informed much more about, I think, with any of us, sort of broad categories that we're placing a new person who we've never met with or interacted with before, sort of into generalized buckets. And if officers don't do as training in several jurisdictions is starting to offer them instruction on, slow down the situation where possible and sort of try to use very intentional decision-making strategies, I think they risk, especially because they often have to make these split-second decisions, being in some instances overly swayed by these subconscious sort of factors that they may not even be aware of, and if they were aware of, they would want to make sure we're not going into their decision making.
Thank you. You're back.
I thank the gentleman from California. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, former United States Attorney, Mr. Radcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although far less successful and accomplished than you, Mr. Chairman, or my other colleague, Mr. Marino, I was also a federal prosecutor, and as such, certainly believe in enforcing the law. Unfortunately, our national dialogue currently on this issue reveals a mistrust on all sides of the issue that we're here to talk about today. But I very much appreciate all of you being here today to talk about how we as a society can address this in a sensitive, careful, and effective manner. And I wish that I had the opportunity to make inquiry to each one of you, but there are time restrictions and I don't. So I'm going to focus at least initially on the witness in the field, if you will, you, Sheriff Clarke. I'd like to first ask you, does your police department have clear policies on the use of force?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, yes, sir.
Do you have an opinion, and I'm sure that you do, as to whether or not there's a problem with the law as it currently stands as it relates to the use of force in this country?
No, I don't.
Okay. So it's your opinion that as Congress, as a member of Congress and with my colleagues here, that there isn't anything that we need to do at this point to make it clearer to officers so that officers aren't second-guessed, if you will, as much as they are currently?
I think that's a proper role for Congress. Advisory, oversight a little bit, but when the mandates start coming down as to how we should do our job at the local level, I'm going to push back a little on that.
So community policing certainly is intended to take the edge off of interactions, if you will, between the police and the communities that they serve. But would you agree with me that police work by its very definition is one that must involve conflict?
Has the great potential for conflict because of human interaction.
And certainly with respect to, at the end of the day, regardless of how the officer goes about his or her job, he or she has a responsibility to enforce the law, whether they are doing it with a smile on their face or not.
Huge responsibility.
All right. Yesterday, the President's Task Force on Policing issued findings that focused squarely on this issue of community policing. I know it's a very hefty document, but I was wondering if you'd had a chance to review it, and if so, what your thoughts were with respect to the findings.
On the 21st Century Project?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I did read it. I didn't like a lot of it from the beginning. When the task force was put together, there were no elected sheriffs. I know my colleague's a former sheriff, but no elected sheriffs on the panel. I found that interesting. And I also didn't see a lot of representation for a two-way exchange with what life is like for the officer on the street. They had some police administrators there. They had one organization that represents some fraternal organization of police, but that doesn't give the day-to-day example of what life is like on the street and why we have to do some of the things that we do. So I thought it fell a little short. Recommendations were heavy on federal involvement, federal control. Those are technical fixes that, okay, we can do that, but it's not going to change the behavior of many law enforcement agencies or the behavior of many of the individuals of color that we come in contact with on a street that end up in deadly confrontations. It doesn't reach far enough to do that.
So, Sheriff, this is your opportunity to talk to members of Congress. What would you like our takeaway to be with respect to that report or those findings, or corrections that you think aren't reflected in there that you'd like to make to that?
Well, one of the things that is not addressed that we keep glossing over, and I said we keep glossing over some of the conditions that have led to the rise of the underclass in the American ghetto, where people can't find meaningful work. They have to send their kids to poor schools. Kids don't have a chance to reach their God-given potential to break out of that cycle of poverty, entrenched poverty. We have to look at some of the urban policies that have been enacted at the state and at the federal level that continue to feed into this growth of the underclass. What we're experiencing recently, it's not the poor generally or black people generally, it's the underclass behavior. Kids growing up without fathers, school failure, failure to stay in the workforce consistently, failure to raise your kids, father-absent homes. Those have nothing to do with the police. You can try to transform the police all you want, but as long as those behaviors, those lifestyle choices are going to continue to grow in these urban centers where there's most assertive policing is needed, you're still going to have these confrontations. And when you try to fight the police and disarm the police, so on and so forth, things aren't going to end up well for you. I don't care how much more we pour into training. It approaches as if it's linear. The world we live in is very asymmetrical.
Sheriff, thank you for your insights and for your thoughtful comments. And again, I thank all of the witnesses for being here today on this important subject. I see that my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. The chair will now recognize my friend from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez.
Thank you so much, Chairman Gowdy. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for making their presentations here this morning. And I'd like to talk just a little bit. I met with a group of young people from the Phoenix Military Academy in the city of Chicago. White youth, Hispanic youth, black youth, military academy. These are the best of the best. Have a conversation, everybody. We should have some of those people. I mean, I think, with all due respect to everybody here, we're a little too old to be having this conversation among ourselves about the problems that the police are encountering with young people. And I would simply suggest that next time we invite some of those young people. So bright, dynamic young people. You know what they're going to tell you, Sheriff Clarke? They're going to tell you, I listened to a young black man, lieutenant colonel in the Phoenix Military Academy, tell me that he has learned how to de-escalate when he is confronted and comes in an exchange with a police officer. That almost brought tears to my eyes. That this wonderful, brilliant young man, dedicated to this country, graduating from his class, has to talk about de-escalating. He doesn't see the police as a source of protection. He sees it as somebody that he has to learn. The police have to be the adults. The children have to learn how to be adults many times in how it is they exchange with police officers. You know, we're having a conversation here where people are saying, well, black people don't care about black people. Nobody's made that claim here. I don't know why certain members of my colleagues here talk about, well, they're not outraged when a black person kills a black person. That's not the issue here. That's really not the issue here. That's certainly an issue we might want to talk about, but it's not the issue. Nobody has made the claim that that's a good thing. You know, that rioters are out there getting paid. Nobody said here it's a good thing that rioters should be paid. I could understand when you're making a forceful argument against something that somebody is like sustaining. But it seems as though we're talking past each other as adults in this room instead of having young people. So I would just like for the record and for those, because I know there won't be enough time, I would like for the record, Mr. Chairman, that these are the questions that the Felix Military Academy students, if I could just have this, Mr. Chairman, for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Look, there's a young Latina, Jasmine Escogido. She said, how can minorities feel less of a double standard during interventions with law? Example, why does it feel like whites are treated with more respect than minorities when questioned by the police? And these are students. And you know, to everybody here, understand something? I have talked to different groups of high school students, and they all tell you the same thing in the inner city. In Chicago last week, there were 45. And so, Sheriff Clarke, you're right, too. There were 45 shootings in one weekend in the city of Chicago. Did I lock my grandson, Luisito, up? No. Did I tell my daughter, don't go on the streets? No. In my neighborhood, none of those shootings happened. In the neighborhood that Luis Gutierrez, the congressman, lives in. It is a tale of two cities. The shootings happen in geographical areas. And in my city, still a city, you know, when I grew up, the majority of the population in the city of Chicago was white. So you would expect the majority of police officers to be white. Yet today, when whites no longer constitute a majority, the majority of police officers in the city of Chicago are white. Is it that we're telling everybody that only white folks want to be police officers and care about this? I think that's a fundamental problem. And so we go to Ferguson, where there might be 2 black police officers in a population that is almost 70% African American. That kind of disconnect is going to cause it. So I would think that we want to talk about some fundamental changes about how it is that we recruit people. And I don't know, Sheriff, maybe you answer this question, maybe you could help me. Because in Chicago, what I feel is, when I go talk to the cops that are in my district, and I go into some of the areas where there's more gang violence, I find it to be younger cops. And I find like the older cops, you know, like when my dad, you know, if he worked somewhere, by the time he had any seniority, he took the good shift, right? Are the young police officers getting the brunt of the work? What do you think?
Yeah, some of that is, Mr. Chair and
If you could just have a moment, just to ask, if the police officers, like, when you join the police force, the older veteran police officers who might have the training and the experience, are they the ones in the neighborhood where there's a lot of trouble and where you might need more veteran police officers? Or is seniority kind of give you a better shift?
Some of that's the collective bargaining issue. You get shift assignment. I agree with your assessment there. The older, wiser, more experienced are in your better assignments because of collective bargaining rules. That is an issue.
And I know we've gone over the time. I just want to say to Mr. Chairman, I hope we can have another hearing. I had a conversation with Mayor Rahm Emanuel. I don't know how many of you got to hear his inaugural speech yesterday, where he dedicated it to the youth and how it was at the city of Chicago that no police force, that no government is going to take the place of a good mom and a good dad, but that we have to be there to make sure that those parents have the resources and that we stop living, even the city of Chicago, in a tale of two cities, where people feel safe in part of the city and where the police and the community are in sync with one another, and another part where they're not. And the last thing is, let's bring the young people. Let's have, with all due respect, I think we could all, I'm 61, so someplace I'm a senior citizen already, so I call myself into that saying, Let's bring some young people. There are not enough young people around here or out there, because they are 100%, as you all know, of our future. And you're not going to settle this issue, I believe, in a great measure, until we get young people and listen to their voices.
Well, the gentleman from Illinois is certainly very young at heart, and he yields back. And the chair would now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize that our subject matter today is talking about policing, but I do want to make reference, because it's come up several times, about why there is an outrage when African Americans are killing African Americans. And I just have to tell you that it's always very frustrating to hear this raised, because it is as though people are not working on a daily basis, day in and day out, to address these issues in neighborhoods. I started an organization 25 years ago. I spent 14 years every day working in South Central Los Angeles in the height of the crack cocaine and Bloods and Crips, all that was going on, to address the crime, to address homicide. There are people working in communities all over this country. But the frustration we have always felt is that it's never covered in the news. What's covered in the news is when there is an incident between the police, and frankly, it's new that that's even being covered in the news, because the only thing that's new here are cell phone cameras, frankly, because what's been going on in communities that's getting a lot of coverage now has been going on for years. And so to say that communities are not concerned, to say that there isn't the outrage over the homicide rate is just not accurate. I spent one summer in one area where homicides were concentrated. We did a whole effort, and we were able to go 3 solid months without homicides, and then the resources ended. So we have to look at the root causes as to why the problems exist. And it's not just a matter of behavior. I frankly don't believe that it's the policeman's job, and I agree with you, Sheriff Clarke. It's not up to the police completely to address these problems. But what has to change in communities is the police working with the community. And unfortunately, people are fearful of the police in some of the communities. It was also asked, what do people in tough neighborhoods want to see happen? People in tough neighborhoods want the same thing that anybody wants. They want to be safe in their homes, and they want to be safe in their neighborhoods. And frankly, these issues aren't just happening in quote-unquote ghettos, and I think it's shameful, frankly, for the communities to even be referred to that way. I have a brother who lives in Beverly Hills. Okay? He gets pulled over by the police, stretched out on the ground, and asked why he's there. And I think that it's well known throughout the country that African Americans, folks of color, can be outside of their quote-unquote ghettos and still have to deal with issues related to the police. A question was raised as to why folks don't cooperate with the police. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples that I experienced on a daily basis working in South Central LA. I can't tell you how many people told me, well, I called the police and I called about this crack house, and the police went to the crack house and said, Miss Jones down the street called and said you were selling crack here. People don't feel that the police will keep them safe, and frankly, there's not enough resources in the community to relocate people. So you want people to go and testify, and you want them to put their lives at risk? If there was more resources, then people would be much more cooperative. We had a lot of problems in LA. We were actually able to turn the situation around with the new chief, with community-based policing. We're having some of the same problems emerge again, but we had a past police chief who said when there was a spate of people who were dying because of chokeholds, he said at a press conference that the reason why African Americans were dying of chokeholds was because our veins were different. They collapsed quicker. We fortunately were able to get rid of that police chief, but these situations can be turned around. And I listened to the testimony of Ms. Ramirez and Ms. Rahr, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. There are other ways to go about policing, and we have seen some changes in communities. Like I said, some of our problems are reemerging in Los Angeles again, But I just wanted to ask in the last couple of seconds, if Ms. Ramirez, if you could give examples of a couple of communities that have turned the situation around, where the police department works in cooperation with community organizations, where the police department has changed their perspective from the warrior mentality over to a mentality that works in partnership with communities, and where crime has been reduced and where trust has been increased with the police department.
The one I know best is Boston, and we have decreased homicide rates. We have decreased the number of people that we have incarcerated, and crime has gone down. And the Boston Police Department has been working with the faith-based community and with community groups on both issues, on issues of homicide. So if we have all these cold cases, as I said earlier, how are we going to get witnesses to come forward? One example of that is some witnesses said, I'd be happy to tell my account to someone who is not a police officer, and then some of that could be used for corroboration to get search warrants. But there are many other examples in this country of excellent community policing models where homicides have gone down. There are now 14 states that have decided to decarcerate, and in each of those states where they have taken the money from the criminal justice system that they were using to incarcerate people, in Massachusetts at $51,000 a year per inmate, taken that money and said, the system that we have is too expensive, it's ineffective, and it's racially disparate, and we're going to use that money to invest in education, to invest in treatment. Those communities have saved money, and crime has gone down.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady from California yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, who, while I realize a lot of people have worked on criminal justice reform, Mr. Richmond's been talking about it since the very first day he got to Washington. Mr. Richmond.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article that gives two Pinocchios to fact-checking Giuliani's claim that 93% of black murder victims are killed by other blacks because of the relevance of the statistics.
Without objection.
Let me just start with answering a question that my colleague posed, and the real question in his mind is black-on-black crime, and what do we do to solve that? Well, the first thing we don't do is cut Pell Grants and cut Head Start, which gives you a 9-to-1 return on your investment. And Pell Grants help you get to college because we all know that education is the best path out of poverty in these circumstances in these neighborhoods. So we could start there, which we've done every year since I've been in Congress with the budgets that we've passed. So I think that that's a very good start. And another start is to just have the conversation. I talk about it all the time. If anybody's concerned, I'm here and willing to address it. And I think that as a young African-American male who grew up in the inner city, I can have a lot to offer. Mr. Sheriff, I'd prefer not to focus where we have differences, and I think we have many. But I think we have some very similar goals, which is to keep our police officers safe and keep our constituents safe, and to provide honest services. Whether it's police or whether it's elected officials, people deserve honest service. Let me just ask you a question from your policing. Do you believe that the makeup of the police department is important in terms of looking similar to the community that it polices?
I believe that.
And I was asking you that because I wanted to share some of my real life experiences as a young African American male and why I think it's so important. First time I was pulled over when I got home from college, and I was in St. Charles Avenue, the fancy part of town, in my mother's car, and I didn't have my license on me. Black officer stopped me. And he went through the process, got my information, ran it, came back to the car and said, I see a Morehouse sticker on the back of your car. You go to Morehouse? I said, yes. He said, well, Martin Luther King, who went to Morehouse, said the man can't ride your back if your back's not bent. And he said, you need to go home. And he let me go, and I went home. And I never forgot that. While I was in the legislature, I saw a white officer stop a car full of white kids on the state capitol grounds who were all smoking marijuana. He gave them a lecture and then call their parents to come get them. In all of my experience, if that white officer had stopped a car full of black kids with marijuana, I don't think that his answer would have been the lecture and let's call the parents. But we have to, and it may just be culture, but I think we have to look at the entire system when you talk about diversion programs, whether they're being applied evenly, because we know that once a kid gets a conviction, especially an African-American male, his life goes in a completely different direction, whether it's marijuana or whether it's something more seriously. So he has a harder time getting financial aid to go to college. He has a harder time getting a job and all of those things. And without a job and without being engaged in society, it's hard to be a good parent. And we have to make sure that our law enforcement scheme, our law enforcement practices is not adding to the hurdles that many people are going to face anyway. So the question becomes, how do we ensure that those officers who have a lot of discretion when they make a stop, how young African-American and minority males and women feel that that officer would give them the same lecture, same break as an African-American officer or officer who's looking at their vested interests? And I hope you can answer that.
The use of discretion is always going to be scrutinized. I reject the notion that every time a white officer stops a car full of black kids that they're going to necessarily go to jail and have their...
Well, I don't think it's every, but it's going to be the majority of the time.
Well, okay, and let's just move beyond that. What I talk to young people about, young people of color, Milwaukee has a significant black population. I'm in these schools, in these neighborhoods. I talk about lifestyle choices. When you engage in behavior and make flawed lifestyle choices, there has to be some accountability. Doesn't mean your life should be ruined. Maybe that can be a learning experience. I don't think an arrest for a small amount of marijuana early in your life is going to be a life-ruining experience. It's not. Will you recover? The biggest virtue, greatest I should say, that my parents instilled in me, I'm the product of a two-parent family, the ability to overcome obstacles. You make mistakes. My dad said, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall down. You're going to fail. You're going to make some questionable decisions. Learn from it and move on. I think that's a better message for even the individuals who have gotten into these situations. I had a young man once stop me on the street as the sheriff. He said, Sheriff, I'm a convicted felon. I can't find work. He said, nobody will hire me because of my felony conviction. And I said, you have kids? He said, yes. I said, how many? He said, 3. I said, there's your job right there, to make sure that your kids don't end up in the predicament that you are. Go home and be a good dad. You know, he thanked me for it. I don't know whether he actually did it. But sometimes that message is a little more helpful to an individual than for me to commiserate in his misery, saying, yeah, it's unfair, and yeah, the man, and yeah, this, yeah, that, and discriminatory criminal justice system and the racist police. They're not going to help the guy. So, you know, that's what I try to do. I don't control all law enforcement officers, but I'm not going to let people indict them with this broad brush like we have the tendency to do sometimes.
Well, in closing, and then I say my time has expired, I would just say that 2 things. I think we should remove the barriers that keep people from moving on and learning and getting past that mistake, which may have been a marijuana conviction or something else. Another thing I would just say is I think it's great advice to tell them to be a father, but at the same time, he still has to get a job and put food on those kids' plate because you can't learn at school if you're hungry. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, Gentleman from Louisiana, and recognizes Gentle Lady from Washington, Ms. Delbene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. In particular, our former King County Sheriff from Washington State, Ms. Rahr, for being here with us. And I actually had a question for you. I know that you've made many changes since you've been at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and you talked a lot about transitioning away from a boot camp or military-style approach to training officers towards a process that emphasizes the role as police as part of our communities, as guardians and protectors rather than military warriors. And I know after a long career as an officer yourself, when you got to the CJTC, you replace the trophy case with the U.S. Constitution and put in place training procedures that include recruits being sprayed with pepper spray so they know what it feels like, instituting psychology classes so trainees can better understand what the people they work with can better understand the people they'll eventually be working with and protecting and interacting with. And I know your methods have not been without skeptics, and so I wondered if you could share with us why you think a new approach to training our young men and women to serve as police officers is needed, especially today, and how these training methods translate to different outcomes or interactions in practice.
Well, thank you for the question. I want to clarify that I don't condemn the training practices in the past. I think we've learned a lot through research and science about how to prepare officers to be more effective. So that's been one of the biggest areas of resistance, is people being offended that somehow by improving our training that we are criticizing what used to be, and that's not the case. We've learned more. In terms of pepper spraying the recruits, many people have misinterpreted that as an attempt to get them to feel empathy. Actually, the reason we do that is we want to put them in a fight for their life stress situation so that they can learn for themselves, that they can overcome extreme pain, extreme fear, and still carry on. When I talk about a guardian mindset, I have to continually reemphasize this is not a kinder, gentler way of doing the job. It's just the opposite. We've actually increased our firearms training. We've increased our defensive tactics training because we want to create strong, effective police officers who have the confidence that they don't have to behave in an intimidating manner. When someone has confidence, that actually tends to de-escalate as well. I think that when we were too focused on the boot camp method of training, it detracted away from our ability to train officers to be critical thinkers. When they were so worried about simply getting the right answer, memorizing checklists, it took away from those critical thinking skills. So what we've tried to shift toward is more of an officer training, the military officers type training, where you really focus on critical thinking and confidence.
And do you think that, yesterday President Obama signed an order restricting certain military equipment from going to police, and do you think that's also part of this transition? How do you feel about that?
Well, I want to be clear that many of those pieces of equipment that police departments obtain through the 1033 program are very much needed in the field. When I was sheriff, I can't tell you how many times I needed that armored personnel carrier to either rescue an officer that was pinned down behind gunfire or a citizen that was pinned down behind gunfire. An armored personnel carrier allows police officers and hostage negotiators to get closer to the scene to actually find ways to resolve the conflict without gunfire. Unfortunately, when that program started, there wasn't a lot of accountability and training that went with it. I believe that's what the changes in the law focus on. Police departments will still be able to get armored personnel carriers because they are absolutely necessary to have in the field. The weapons, the rifles, those type of equipment, those are also necessary, and they're less expensive when we get them through the military. So I hope there's an opportunity down the road for people to understand more clearly the benefits of that program, but also the necessity of the accountability that comes with it.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Thank you, General Lay from Washington. The chair would now recognize his friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work on criminal justice reform as well as we try to work toward a productive resolution of the challenges that we face here in America. I think most would agree that in a democracy, we just need a balance between effective law enforcement on the one hand and a healthy respect for the Constitution, for civil rights and civil liberties on the other. And what people want in inner city communities like those I represent, or as Sheriff Clarke would refer to it as the ghetto, what people want is to make sure that the constitutional principle of equal protection under the law applies to everyone. And there's concern that in certain instances that's not the case. The overwhelming majority of police officers are hardworking individuals who are there to protect and serve the community. That is my position. I believe that is the position of everyone who's genuinely interested in police reform. But we can't ignore the fact that we have a problem in some instances with the excessive use of police force and the fact that often it is the case when a police officer crosses the line, they are not held accountable by the criminal justice system. And that creates consequences in terms of a distrust in many communities, perhaps leading to the absence of cooperation. And let me just start with Sheriff Clarke. You mentioned in your testimony that black-on-black crime is the elephant in the room that few want to talk about. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
We've had a very robust discussion about it today. Have you been satisfied? It's come up several times.
Not at all.
Okay, you're not satisfied. Now, I agree it's a problem. 80% of whites kill whites, correct?
I won't dispute that figure.
Okay, actually, it's 83%. Now, is white-on-white violence a problem in America that we should also have a robust discussion about?
Violence in America, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, Congressman, violence in America in general is problematic. But if you look at the rates, that's where it starts coming a little more into balance in terms of the data I've seen, and I've looked at a lot of it. The white-on-white crime does happen, 80% figure you put out there, but when you look at the rates of it, these two are not even close.
Right, the rates are roughly equivalent in terms of the context of people who live next to each other, and because of housing segregation patterns or just where people tend to live in America, ethnic violence tends to occur, racial violence within the same group. And so elevating it beyond that fact, I think, is irresponsible. We all want to deal with the black-on-black violence problem. Now, it was mentioned that there's a cooperation issue in the black-on-black violence context. I don't think I've heard the phrase mentioned, blue wall of silence, here. So if we're going to have a conversation about cooperation when someone crosses the line, seems to me to make sense that we also have to deal with what may be another elephant in the room, to use your term, Sheriff Clarke, the blue wall of silence, that the overwhelming majority of officers are good officers. But what often occurs is that when an officer crosses the line, the ethic is not to cooperate or participate or speak on what a bad apple officer has done. Professor Ramirez, would you agree that that's perhaps something that we should also be focused on?
I think it's a serious problem both at the federal and state level. And as I said earlier, in my own experience in trying to prosecute police officers, I had problems. Here's just one problem. The FBI and DEA said we won't even serve subpoenas on a case in which there's a police officer as a defendant. Here's a second problem. They tried to testify in the case in favor of the police officer, saying that they had made their own independent evaluation of the case. This is a case, by the way, that was adjudicated guilty against all officers, and they were incarcerated for between 10 and 20 years after the trial. And as you know, in Boston, we had a problem with the FBI, that there were FBI agents who were engaged in a series of misconduct with Whitey Bulger, and that went on for many years and was not prosecuted.
Thank you, Professor Ramirez. My time is getting ready to expire, but Sheriff Clarke, you also mentioned that, the use of force should be examined in terms of factual data and not an emotional foundation of false narratives. Is that correct? Did I get your testimony correct in that regard?
Mr. Chair and Congressman, yes.
Okay. Now, was the reaction to the Eric Garner case, who was choked to death using a procedure that had been banned by the NYPD for more than 20 years, wasn't resisting arrest, said, "I can't breathe" 11 times on 11 different occasions. There was no response by all of the police officers who were there. Was that a false narrative that people in the city of New York and the country are reacting to, sir?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, first of all, he wasn't choked to death, not from the report that I had seen out of the grand jury testimony, and even from the medical examiner's report. He wasn't choked to death.
The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by asphyxiation. In the ghetto, that's called being choked to death, sir.
Well, we can have this discussion later on then about the facts, because we could be here for a while. My understanding is he died of a heart attack, okay? So, but anyway, you said that he wasn't resisting arrest. He was resisting arrest. He was told that he was under arrest and put his hands behind his back, and he wouldn't do so. And that's why I put in my remarks here the reference from Thomas Sowell about when law enforcement officers tell someone they're under arrest and they can't use force to execute that arrest. We don't have the rule of law when it's merely a suggestion for them that they're going to jail or to put their hands behind their back. Those are behaviors, like in the instance of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where some different choices by the individual could have helped the situation. In other words, Mike Brown was just simply told to get out of the street.
Sir, my time has expired, but, you know, for you to come here and testify essentially that Eric Garner is responsible for his own death when he was targeted by police officers for allegedly selling loose cigarettes, which is an administrative violation for which he got the death penalty for, is outrageous. And if we are going to have a responsible conversation, we've got to be able to at least agree on a common set of reasonable facts that all Americans can interpret, particularly in this instance because they caught the whole thing on videotape. And I yield back.
Chair thanks his friend from New York. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Judge Gomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here, for your thoughtfulness. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time on these issues through your career rather than just the time here today. And it is a difficult issue. I saw a report, though, this morning from the task force, and I understand we have a member here, but it quotes the task force as saying, quote, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security should terminate the use of a state and local criminal justice system, including through detention, notification, transfer requests, to enforce civil immigration laws against civil or non-serious criminal offenders. And I'm wondering, to fix the problem that we saw explode there in Ferguson and in Baltimore, is there anybody, any one of our witnesses that thinks preventing state and local law enforcement officers from notifying the feds about people illegally in the country, that would do anything to solve the problems in Ferguson or Baltimore? Anybody? I mean, I'm also perplexed, having been a prosecutor, rode along with law enforcement back in those days, a district judge handling felonies, Court of Appeals, Chief Justice. We had a real problem with the federal government not picking up criminals. They would tell our local law enforcement, this person is illegally in the country, so we have jurisdiction. And the task force makes a comment about non-serious criminal offenders. I think it was 9 DWIs a fellow had that was in my court. He finally came to felony court after he hurt and nearly killed some folks, but I sentenced him to prison because he was not being deported, and about 6 months later he's back in my courtroom because he said through the interpreter, well, the federal people took me to the border and told me to walk across the bridge, and then when they left, I came back across. And he got back, got drunk again in another accident. I'm really having trouble with the task force thinking this is going to solve any problems with regard to racial difficulties in our cities. I just, and perhaps, you know, you can help me out here. I know, Ms. Rahr, you had a just really great career. You've served your community, your country now. I mean, do you see getting immigration of, just having state and local law enforcement to avoid any discussion about immigration, is that really going to help problems in our cities?
As I recall, the recommendation doesn't say there should be no cooperation. It's the discussion that we had in the task force involved the balance of public safety. And there are many communities where there are large groups of undocumented people living in neighborhoods that commit crimes and are victimized by crimes. And because there is such a fear of being deported, a lot of victims don't call the police because they're afraid of deportation. This is particularly a problem in domestic violence situations. This is.
I know I saw that same concern by the big group of people illegally here in the gallery that were trying to disrupt. I've seen people illegally here in this gallery disrupting, and I didn't note a lot of concern about law enforcement deporting them, because you have to be pretty ignorant about what's going on in this country to think that you're at risk for deportation. Anyway, I'm more concerned about the victims who are victims of crime needlessly. If we would enforce at least the immigration laws on those who commit crimes, and we're not doing it. And so what I see is a disregard for law enforcement, because they're not even going to help, because this person is illegally in the country, so nothing's going to happen to them, and I end up being the one victimized. I hear that as much as anything, but I appreciate your sensitivity to these issues. I know the first couple of murder cases I worked on as a prosecutor, we had it was an African-American shot an African-American in both cases. They were both in bars, and we had people in the community, including the African-American community, saying, well, they shouldn't have been there. It's not that big a deal. I found it offensive then that anybody would care about the race, and when somebody kills somebody else, it's not a big deal. I'm still concerned after all these years. We prosecuted those. We had concern. We didn't care what the race was of the victim or of the defendant. A killing is a killing, and I'm glad that y'all care about law enforcement in America. Thanks for your input.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, and then the gentleman from Texas after that. Gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I think everyone on this committee brings their own life experiences and perspectives here. And before I came to Congress, a long time ago, I was a criminal defense and civil rights lawyer. Most of my civil rights cases involved claims of police brutality. And I went from that to being mayor of Providence, where I was the acting public safety commissioner for 8 years, overseeing, obviously, the Providence Police Department, and proud to report that in those 8 years we brought the crime rate to its lowest rate in 40 years. And so I bring my own set of experiences and have deep, deep respect for law enforcement and for the hard work of dedicated, good police officers. And nothing will be seared in my mind more directly than April 17th of 2005, when a police officer in Providence was murdered in the Providence Police headquarters. So I understand the hard work of our police, and I understand the importance of what they do. And I think we do have to focus on systems which build good review and detection of police misconduct, good oversight and civilian reviews, disciplinary procedures, prosecutions, all of that. But what I want to focus on, because I think the fact is those are important to do, and we have got to do them to rebuild trust between the police and the community. But in many ways, it's too late when those problems have already occurred. And so what I really want to focus on is what do we do to help ensure that those kinds of situations don't occur? How do we build this mutually respectful relationship between police and community? I had a police chief who always used to say, you should have a family doctor, a family lawyer, and a family police officer. And we built a community policing model in which there were lieutenants that were in charge of a neighborhood. And they knew the residents of that neighborhood. Everyone in that neighborhood had their cell phone numbers. They were on housing boards. They were on nonprofits. They became part of the community. That's what helped result in the lowest crime rate in 40 years. So that's good not only for the community, it's good for the police officers, the good police officers who deserve to have the respect and trust of their community. But at the core of this, as my chief used to always say, the most powerful weapon I have, the most powerful piece of equipment is the trust of the community. And that is the single best tool I have to reduce crime in the city. And we saw the results of that kind of attitude. So what I'd like to hear from the witnesses, I think there are two ways to help achieve that kind of paradigm. Accreditation is one, and community policing implementation is the other. Not a unit within your department, but the entire department embracing this attitude of service and guardianship. And so what are the impediments, Mr. Hartley? I know, Providence went from a department when I took office that was under investigation by the Department of Justice for patterns and practice violations and other investigations to an accredited police department. But that's a hard process. So is it resources? How can we help more departments go through this accreditation process so that we know they have standards and practices in place that respect this important balance that was mentioned between keeping communities safe and respecting the civil rights of individuals? What are the impediments? What can Congress do to assist many more police departments to go through that accreditation process?
Well, thank you, Mr. Congressman. I will tell you, this is a complicated picture for us because, as you know, it costs to be involved in these programming. So we've talked a little bit about funding to help support organizations that want to pursue that. But I also think it's critically important that there's a broader awareness that there's other resources inside the law enforcement public safety community that exist to help agencies go through that. If you've been involved in it yourself, if you spoke there's police accreditation coalitions out there that bring tremendous resources because some organizations simply don't have the capacity to develop policy to support the accreditation itself. So those organizations exist to help shepherd organizations in that particular direction.
Should we consider requiring departments over a certain period of time to at least develop a plan to reach accreditation? I mean, it's a pretty good, sort of the gold standard of policing that police departments, I think, universally aspire to. But should we, rather than just encourage it, should we be considering some system where we're requiring departments at least to articulate a plan to get to that place?
I think the requirement to consider how you might implement it is important, but I also tell you that the way we're structured to review agencies and assess their credibility, if you will, doesn't have investigatory authority, nor are we seeking that. And in some ways, if you require it, it becomes a regulatory body, which in some ways I think prevent the integrity of the process from moving forward effectively. So I want to be cautious about that, but I think incentives to support organizations moving in that direction is critically important.
So I just have a few seconds left. I just wonder if any of the witnesses have any suggestions on how we might encourage or incentivize departments to really transform themselves into this community policing model. And I know, Ms. Ramirez, you talked about a community policing institute, but I think the other part of that, which no one has mentioned today, is we have to figure out ways to encourage our police departments or require our police departments to ensure that they reflect the diversity of the communities they serve. We have too many departments across this country that don't look like the people that they serve, and the value of people coming from the neighborhood who understand the cultural traditions, the social mores, the different parts of the neighborhood who are parts of that community, and who return back to that neighborhood after work at night is incredibly valuable. And I don't know that we've heard enough about how do we ensure police departments reflect the diversity of the communities they serve.
In my experience, the most important thing to lead somebody to go into a career of law enforcement is to have a personal connection to someone who's already a cop. And the way you get that is by building community trust and those connections. I know it's very popular to say that officers should live in the communities where they police. In my county, most of our officers can't afford to live there, and so it's not realistic. But when you assign a deputy or an officer to the same neighborhood for a long period of time, those connections grow. And when that officer or deputy is rewarded for participating in the community, not just enforcing the law, but also participating, that connection grows. It's the anonymity that really is the enemy here.
Mr. Ramirez, it looks like you wanted to say something.
This is on diversifying police departments, so I just wanted to add a fact. In Massachusetts, we have a civil service system, and every police department chief who's been chief while I was there has tried to diversify the police department. The top scorer in Massachusetts, the person who got the highest grade on the exam they have to take to be a police officer, was 328th on the list. And the reason for that is a whole series of preferences, mostly veterans' preferences. And I think a lot of the police chiefs are trying to figure out how they can reform the civil service system such that they can diversify the police department. And they're stuck. And they need some help. Do they need an inspector general? Do they need a state community justice institute? Or do they need some fact-finding process that can look at to what extent there are legal and civil service challenges for police chiefs who are trying to diversify their police departments?
Chair, thanks to the gentleman from Rhode Island, and would now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe.
Thank the chairman. I'm way over here on the
this end. Thank all of you all for being here. I'm a former prosecutor in Houston, former judge, spent 30 years at the courthouse. I tried people who assaulted and killed police officers both as a prosecutor and as a judge, and I have tried cases as a prosecutor of police officers who have killed individuals and charged with violation of the law. So I've seen both sides of this perspective for a long time, having only tried criminal cases. Sheriff, I'll start with you. Do you have any idea how many arrests, felony arrests, are made a year by police agencies in the country?
No, I don't.
Would you care to guess? Or you just don't have
No.
any idea? I don't have any idea either. That's why I'm asking. Does anyone know how many arrests are made by police officers?
It's available through the, sorry, Mr. Chair and Congressman, it's available through the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and I believe the FBI would probably have some data on that as well.
Okay, well, we'll find that out then. Would you say or not that the vast majority of those encounters with the police and a citizen are done according to the rule of law on the part of the peace officer?
Without a doubt.
How many would you say are not? There's some violation of the law, some violation of the rights of the accused in those felony cases?
Law of averages is what I'm basing that on.
So what would it be?
Wouldn't care to assign a number to it because I don't know.
Is it a majority or the minority?
Oh, it's very low.
Okay. It seems to me that when that any police agency needs to have a plan for all circumstances. Would you agree with that or not? Some type of response to community policing, a protocol, whether it's a one-on-one arrest. I'll give you an example. I'm sure you're familiar with the event that took place in Waco, the town of the chairman's alma mater, Baylor, this weekend, where you have 5 motorcycle gangs, 3 of which, the Cossacks, the Bandidos, and the Mongols, all assembled together in a place. Trouble ensued. Shots are fired, and a dozen police officers are there. 9 people are killed. Others are wounded, but the shooting stopped. The police made 11, 12 police officers, maybe a few more, arrested 170 individuals. Do you think that having a plan to respond to that type of situation is important for a local police agency to have? Apparently they did. They had some plan involved.
Without a doubt, but I also think that in the moments leading up to the question I asked is what kind of intelligence they had or information that this thing was going to go down, and just in terms of these rival groups coming together.
Well, I'm sure they had lots of intelligence. It appears that they had intelligence. And that's part of also a plan, is it not, to respond based upon the intel you get from what's taking place or may take place?
Right, and part of that response really needs to be the pre-planning, the pre-staging, pre-marshaling of resources. When you have that many individuals coming together, you can't just have a handful of officers because you don't have time to wait to be calling in reinforcements. So the planning is huge.
Well, no matter what the situation is, whether it's going to be a big event or a small event, police planning and response so that the rule of law is followed no matter the circumstances is a good idea for policing, is it not?
It's critical.
Okay.
Yes.
How many peace officers were killed in the line of duty last year?
Last year, I know they added 238 names to the wall here at the National. Some of those were previous years, though. And I do know that It's up nearly 90% so far in the first quarter of this year, around 54 officers killed in the line of duty. So the exact total out of that 238 from last year, I don't have.
All right. I had some more questions. I'll submit them in writing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. The gentleman from Texas yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from Texas who has a unanimous consent motion.
May I, in unanimous consent, just say one or 2 points, Mr. Chairman, on this committee. First of all, let me ask the chairman to have unanimous consent to enter into the record the following documents: a statement and testimony from the American Civil Liberties Union, a statement from the National Urban League, Executive Order 13688, which provides federal standards for acquisition of military equipment, a letter from Mr. Conyers, Mr. Scott, Mr. Cohen requesting a hearing in 2014. Excuse me, I guess it's from myself. From myself, Mr. Scott, Mr. Cohen, I'm sorry. Mr. Scott, Mr. Cohen, and Mr. Conyers. And then a article entitled Law Enforcement Warrior Problem to be added into the record, Mr.
Without objection.
And then, Mr. Chairman, if I might, just in thanking the witnesses, just make one simple comment. And that is, I want to express to all of you the significance of your testimony, and that the Judiciary Committee, through our chairman and ranking member and those of us who work on these issues, are very serious about coming forward in the spirit of recognizing the pain of an officer's death and the pain of a civilian's confusion and apprehension about police and maybe even their death. And I frankly believe we can find that common ground. I hope that you will allow us to inquire of you. We did not get to question everyone. I hope that you will make yourself resources as we write forward to address a mother's pain and as well find that even place. And I end my remarks by quoting a philosopher, Joanne von Goth: treat people as if they were what they should be, and you help them become what they're capable of being. Justice Hand said, if we are to keep our democracy, there must be one commandment. And Sheriff Clarke, I think this is what you're speaking of. Thou shalt not ration justice. Everyone deserves justice. And we do not deny your officers justice. And we've got to let the civilian population, no matter who they are, know that they will get justice. That is what this committee's purpose is. And I hope that we will have some more provocative hearings, maybe those who've lost loved ones, maybe the young people who are raising the signs because of their passion of Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, and as well, I Can't Breathe. Let's give all of those persons dignity. And this hearing has been one to give all of us hearing, including Sheriff, all of the men and women that you represent, and you have represented them. I yield back to the chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. On behalf of Mr. Conyers and the entire committee, I want to thank our panel of witnesses for your expertise, for your experience, your life experience, your perspective, your collegiality, not only with one another, but also with the members of the committee. And I could not help but think while Judge Poe was talking, and Tommy Marino and Mr. Richmond and Mr. Jeffries, that we are all in part beneficiary, but also part prisoner of our own background, our own experience. Prosecutors may not have the benefit of a judicial view like Judge Poe has, or what Cedric described growing up is something that I would not have experienced growing up. So I think it is a good idea for us, to the extent that we can, to rely upon the experiences of other people, well-intentioned people, and there are a lot of issues raised, all of which are important. The issue that I hope we can have another committee hearing on at some point, and I think Hakeem, Mr. Jeffries from New York, touched upon it, the failure to cooperate on that end impacts the prosecution of police officers who have done wrong. I saw the failure to cooperate in the faces of moms and dads who were trying to get justice for their murdered young people. Because other witnesses would not cooperate. So I think we all want a justice system that is respected. In fact, we have to have a justice system that is respected, or we're not going to make it. So I hope this is the first of many hearings. And again, on behalf of Mr. Conyers and all the other members who participated, we want to thank you for your participation. This concludes today's hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. With that, thank you very much. We are adjourned.